Good morning. I'm Donald Ware, here to introduce Maurice Cotterell from England, now living in Ireland. I find his title today very intriguing, The Secrets of the Supergods. Maurice is an engineer and a scientist. He has degrees in electrical and communications engineering and a degree in business. He did speak here about 10 years ago at our conference. We found that interesting. He is an author of 6 books. I believe you see the titles up there, ranging from the Mayan prophecies in 1995 to the Celtic Chronicles, 2005. I don't want to take any more of his time, so let me introduce, please welcome Maurice Cotterell.
Thanks. Hi there. Good morning, and thank you very much for the introduction. I'm sorry about the confusion this morning. I find this everywhere I go. People are trying to be helpful, and they offer me a Rolls Royce, and all I want is a Model T Ford. And it often presents problems like this. The difficulty with this kind of material is that it's just so unusual. So very, very unusual. Now you may think, what's this got to do with UFOs? Well, it's got a great deal to do with the UFOs, as we'll see as the morning unfolds. Now, I always feel when I begin a talk like this, it reminds me of the old story about the guy who goes into a shoe shop, and the assistant says, what size do you take? And he says, well, I normally take an 8, but 9 feels so much more comfortable, I think I'll have a 10. However, it's sort of back-to-front way of an analogy using that story, because normally this stuff takes about 16 hours to talk about. I've done it in 8 hours, and today I've got to do it in 3.5. So I'll just, by way of introduction, I'll just try and describe how I got interested in this kind of, this area of research, which covers everything in life. There's no stone unturned that this doesn't touch. When I was 8 years old, I used to keep pigeons as a small boy in Manchester, England, where I grew up. And I used to take the pigeons about 5 miles away on my bicycle and release them. And I noticed that the birds flew around once or twice in a circle and then headed for home across the horizon. And as they went, they zigzagged all the way until they got home before me, of course, because I went back and they were already home. And I began to question, how could a pea-brained, or a bird with the size of a pea, find its way home over such long distances? I had to wait another 12 years after that until I went to sea in the Merchant Navy in England as a radio officer. And I was standing on board, standing in the wheelhouse on board the ship, and we were in a storm. And every time a wave came over, the ship went to the left, and I noticed the gyro compass would skew around, and then the rudder at the back would go the opposite way, and the ship would come back on course. And when I looked at the course recorder, I could see the course recorder was following a zigzag. So it seemed to me that the pigeons must be sensing the magnetic field, just like the gyro compass was sensing the movement of the ship. So I joined my first ship. It was in February 1970. We sailed down the Manchester Ship Canal, and I began to notice behavioural changes in the crew. When we went north to south, they were quite happy. But when we started going east to west, they all started to argue. And I watched this over the years that followed, the 12, 13 years that followed, and I started to analyse the behaviour of the crew and consider what might be making their behaviour change as we moved from left to right. Now, in those days, those were the days of the brand new jetliners, the 707, and jet lag was really unheard of then. But we became more familiar with the fact that when we move across the magnetic lines of force on the Earth, that our brains are affected and we produce more or less of the timing hormone melatonin. Since then, we've come a long way with understanding how the endocrine system, hormones, work. I became very interested in astrology, or the determination of personality. How could the astrologers, as the astrologers say, the stars affect a human being? Well, being rational and logical, I decided it's got to have something to do with the genes. It's got to be in the genes. There must be a scientific explanation for all this. After all, I'd seen the effects on board ship. So I guess I was born at a lucky time because there were many changes in scientific discoveries during the 70s and 50s, 60s, 70s. Many scientific discoveries around the time. One of them, for example, in 1957, was the discovery of the Van Allen belts, the belts of radiation that encircle the Earth. And James Van Allen, the American engineer who worked at NASA, discovered these in 1957. And we now understand that these belts absorb the radiation from the sun and protect the Earth. In 1961, the next development came from Mariner 2 spacecraft. And Mariner 2 spacecraft sent back signals of particles that were being detected from the sun. At the time, we couldn't understand what they are, but now we're familiar with them. And the sun, it seemed, was spinning and sprinkling out particles towards the Earth. Positive particles for 7 days, negative particles for 7 days, positive particles for about 4, and then we get some mixture here of both. And then another sector of particles. Now, these particles, the positive charges are the nuclei of the hydrogen atom as we get nuclear fusion in the sun. The negative particles are electrons that are smashed off the atom. And we now know they travel to Earth and they get caught up in these Van Allen belts. Now, I've put together this model of the sun. And I don't know if you can see that. Can you see that sphere? That's better. Put it there. And this is the sun, and this is the Earth. And the Earth goes around the sun once every 365 days. We now know that the sun has 4 bubbles of magnetic field around its equator. 1, 2, 3, 4. And it has a north pole and a south pole. Every 11 years, the north pole changes polarity. The top becomes minus, the bottom becomes positive. Now, in the next 3 or 4 minutes, you're going to get slightly confused. And you say, what's this guy talking about? This is out of my area of activity. I need to go through this process just for a few minutes, and then you'll understand why I want to confuse you for a few minutes. So let me make it quite clear. Now, what I did was, in 1989, while working at Cranfield University, I had a question of, how long would it take the 3 magnetic fields, or the 3 parameters, excuse me, okay, the sun, now we know from Mariner 2, spins every 28 days, and we know the Earth goes round every 365 days. But we also have the planet Mercury here, and Mercury moves round every 87 days. So Mercury moves 4 degrees a day around the sun. And as it does so, the gravitational field and the magnetic field pull the middle of the sun around more quickly than the top and the bottom. So I asked a question, when would the polar magnetic field, that's the blue one, and the equatorial magnetic field come back together if they started off? And I was working at Cranfield, so I had access to the biggest computer at the time in the UK. And I wanted to know when these 3 variables would all be back together, because that would be a cycle of magnetic activity. Now, I knew that this one, the North Pole, rotates every 37 days. If you're on the Earth, because the Earth has moved during that 37 days, it takes longer. It's 40 days altogether. The equator goes round once every 26 days. But if you're on the Earth, it takes 2 days longer to line up 28 days. So I thought there had to be a way of calculating when these 2 magnetic fields and the Earth are all in a line again. Astronomers said, this is impossible. You've got 1 magnetic field there and 1 magnetic field there. How can you describe the sun's magnetic field with regard to the Earth? It's impossible. So I thought about this, and I thought, well, it's not impossible, because I know every 87 days they overlap. The pole is overlapping the equator every 87 days. They're both moving, but every 87 days, the North Pole overlaps the equator. So I thought, if I close my eyes for 87 days and only open them after 87 days, they will both be glued together And if I close my eyes for 87 days again and move them around, in 87 days they'd both be glued together, but in a different position. In a mathematical sense, this is differentiating the polar cap with respect to the equator. It's called, Isaac Newton invented differentiation in calculus. So this is what I applied that to, but with rotational variables. And I was able to put a graph together. Once these two were glued together, I could then make a graph of the sun's magnetic field in regard to the Earth. And the results were very interesting. I'll come back to that in a few seconds. But now we know why. We get 7 days negative particles coming to the Earth from the sun. Then we get 7 days positive particles, 7 days negative particles, 7 days positive particles. But what we know is that if these two begin rotating together, the blue one and the equator, because the equator is going more quickly, the blue one falls behind. So that after 1 month, the blue one has moved backwards through field number 1. There's 1, 2, 3, 4. During the next month, the North Pole will move back through field number 2. So if you're on the Earth, you won't see number 2 that month. What you'll see is 1, 3, and 4. The next month, the North Pole will move through number 2. So you won't see number 2 that month. 3, sorry. You will see 1, 2, and 4. So every month, the polar cap burns out one of those sectors. And we see this here, the polar cap sliding backwards, where the particles are both negative and positive as the North Pole slides through them. Now, during about 1927, a German psychologist, Johannes Lange, did some studies on twins. He wanted to find out if behavior was genetic or whether or not it was caused by environmental influences. And he took 15 sets of twins, and he studied the ones that had been separated at birth, the ones where one twin had gone to America and one had stayed in, for example, Europe. And he noticed that each twin committed the same criminal act at the same age throughout their lives. And therefore he concluded that it must be a function of heredity. In other words, that they must inherit these criminal tendencies. Now, he was almost right, but he was a victim of his own research. Because if we look at the siblings here of the twins, these are the sets of twins, the Ostag twins, the Lauterbeck twins, the Ryder twins, and so on, and the brothers. We have Alan, for example, A, and Kay, for example, Kevin, that at the age of 23, one committed fraud and embezzlement, and Kevin, for him, it was at the age of 26. But the parents had no criminal records, and the brothers and sisters, one had a record, but none had, but he had epileptic fits. When we analyze the data, what we find is we would expect the brothers and sisters to have a criminal tendency, just like their twin brothers and sisters, with a ratio of 1 to 4. But this doesn't happen here. So although Lange was correct, it was genetic, it wasn't necessarily down to heredity. It didn't necessarily come from the parents. In other words, if we had a deck of cards from the parents, the cards could be shuffled up after the parents had released the sperm and the ovum. That's when the cards deck was shuffled, and that's when the personality was created. So I analyzed the 4 types of radiation. If you remember, during the first month of solar activity, we lost field sector number 1. So what we had was, when we didn't have number 1, we had 2, 3, and 4, which was 2 positive, 3 negative, 4 positive. 2 positives and 1 negative means it was positive. The next month, we didn't have number 2, which was a positive. But we had number 1, which was negative, and number 3, which was negative, so we've got 2 negatives and a positive. The next month, we didn't have number 3. The next month, we didn't have number 4. And then they repeated, of course, because once you've gone through the 4, you have to start again. I'm now explaining how astrology works, by the way. A few years later, in 1982, a Professor Ian Nicholson in England discovered that when the particles leave the Van Allen belts, when the solar particles impinge upon the Van Allen belts, the particles go up and down from North Pole to South Pole every 1 second. And the magnetic field on the Earth varies, it modulates. And just after that, in 1989, Dr. Ross Adey, who was President Reagan's medical advisor, discovered that, a team at the Naval Institute at Bethesda, Maryland, discovered that magnetic fields in the overhead lights were causing genetic mutations in their test tubes. So here we have a mechanism whereby particles leave the sun. There's 4 types of radiation. Every month we get number 1, number 2, number 3, number 4. 4 different types of radiation. Those particles travel to Earth. The magnetic field on the Earth changes to either a number 1, either a number 2, or number 3, or number 4. When the sperm enters the egg, the magnetic fields from the Van Allen belts shake up the genes in the egg as it's developing. And what we have then, because we've got 4 types of genes, we have 4 types of personality. For example, fire, Aries, Taurus, Gemini, and Cancer. And then, of course, the sun gets back to where it started, and it repeats. With we have another fire sign, Leo, followed by Virgo, followed by Sagittarius, or whatever. Forgive me. I'm trying to think ahead. So we understand how the genes are shaken up. Now, this is not new. Here's a stained glass window from Hengrave Hall in England, which is 15th century church. And here we see God the Son with his breath, blowing his breath, the solar wind, onto the earth in the middle here. And we see the signs of the zodiac on the outside. And God has in his hand the sun, the sphere of the sun there. So what we find is that even around 1450, 600 years ago, the ancients understand how the solar wind affected life on Earth and created the 12 types of personality. I then started to consider, it was all very well saying, well, we understand that the sun affects behavior, but how could I measure that? How could I check it? So I considered that perhaps what I was saying was that the sun affects the endocrine system, and that affects the genes when the sperm enters the egg. So is there any other way that I could measure changes in the endocrine system, the hormones, and the sun? So I thought, well, the most obvious measure would be to measure the 28-day signal of the sun and see if any of the hormones, female hormones, change every 28 days. And here we have the sun. We've got 28 days negative, 28 days positive, negative, positive, and I've drawn that out as a sine wave, positive, negative, positive, negative. Now what I'm saying is, does anything happen to the female hormones after day 7, 14, 21, or 28? If there does, then I can say, well, the sun is regulating hormones, and that's the causal agent, if you like. So I had a look at the 28-day cycle of the female hormones, estrogen and progesterone, and I equated these with the follicle-stimulating hormone here, which is responsible for kick-starting the luteinizing hormone and the production of estrogen and progesterone. And on the face of it, there was no, on first inspection, there was no correlation. In other words, I said, what happens to the follicle-stimulating hormone after 7 days? Well, nothing. Not a lot's going on. What happens after 14 days? Not a lot. What happens after 21? Not a lot. Then what I decided to do was, I put this follicle-stimulating hormone graph here, that's this one here, and I put it on top of the 28-day cycle, like so, and I rotated it like so. And what I've discovered was that the follicle-stimulating hormone is switched on day 2.5 of the sun. So as the sun spins, the follicle-stimulating hormone starts to produce the hormone. And then it follows the sunspot cycle for 14 days and stops. On the 14th day, we have the follicle-stimulating hormone, the red one. In addition, we have the solar cycle itself underneath. So we've got 2 cycles which add together. That gives us a pulse in the luteinizing hormone, which is this one here. So we get a massive pulse on day 14, and that changes the amount of estrogen and progesterone being produced by the lining of the womb, which either tells the lining of the womb to accept the egg or to reject it and go through the process of menstruation. So what we found was, when I looked into it in a lot of detail, and that's all in the Tutankhamun prophecies, because the ancient civilizations were well aware of this mechanism, what we find is that as the sun spins every 28 days, showers the earth with particles, just as we said before. The particles go up and down every 1 second. The magnetic field varies every 1 second. This affects the pineal gland in the female brain. The female brain affects the production of melatonin, the timing hormone, and that affects the production of estrogen and progesterone. And that's why females menstruate every 28 days. Of course, sometimes you say, sometimes it's 32 days and 24. If this goes round, what you'll find is you'll have 28 days, 28 days, 28 days, 32 days, 28, 28, 28, 34 days, 28, 28. So it'll go backwards and forwards as the North Pole slides through the equator. Now, there have been experiments to show that when females are placed underground, this was one in New Scientist in 1989, showing a student, Stephanie Follini, and NASA placed her underground in a cave in New Mexico. She was awake for 35 hours, and then she slept for 10 hours. She lost 17 pounds in weight, and her menstrual cycle stopped. Now, this is very interesting stuff, because now we know if we put pregnant females underground or females underground, they can't have babies. They can't reproduce without the sun. And that's why this is so important. What happens if we put a dog underground? Maybe the dog can't reproduce. What happens if we put a mouse underground? What happens if we put the AIDS virus underground? Would the virus stop replicating? We know when we go out into the sunshine, we get herpes, the cold sores, the blister comes out because of the solar radiation. Take away the radiation, we take away the fertility. And this is one of the reasons why we can never leave the planet. I'll go on to that in a second. Now, why don't all females menstruate at the same time? Well, I didn't knock this up over the weekend. Okay? And I assure you, if you have any questions, I'll be very happy to answer them. But that's a 16-hour version. Now, imagine it like this. Imagine a carousel where the sun is the roof of the carousel. And we have 4 horses. And let's say you're the manager of the ride, and you stand here, and a female comes along, and she takes her place on the ride, and she sits on the horse. Then the manager moves the carousel around 90 degrees, and this horse goes up in the air, but the next horse comes down to the ground, and the next passenger gets on board. The manager moves the carousel around another 90 degrees, and passenger number 3 gets on the third horse at the back, and then passenger 4 gets on, and the ride begins. They're all going up and down at different times, but they're all going up and down every 28 days. And that's what I call asynchronous synchronization. Another effect of the sun is that, as I mentioned earlier, because the equator is rotating more quickly than the North Pole and the South Pole, the magnetic field around the equator becomes bent. And in 1962, 2 engineers, Babcock and Layton, suggested a process that was going on, saying, well, it looks like the magnetic field that goes from north to south is getting wound up around the sun. It's bursting out into these spots. If you look at the sun, you get these black spots. They're magnetic fields. They're magnetism bursting out of the sun, but we see them as black areas. And they're understood pretty well nowadays. When I was at Cranfield and I started to look at the sunspot cycle, I made a graph out of asking the question, when would those 3 parameters be back together again? And I started the graph by hand, and after about 5 months I gave up. So I said to the girl in the computer center, put these figures into the computer. 37 days, 26 days, 365.25 days. When will they come back together? She said, well, that's easy. If this is 37, and that's 26, that's 962. And if that's a year, it's 962. I said, well, yeah, I know that. But I want to see the graph as it progresses, because I suspect there's a lower common denominator, and they actually come together before that. Don't know when it's going to be. It might be after 500 years. It might be 300 years. I can't see unless I've got a graph. And I can't work out the lowest common denominator because of the fractions involved, the decimal points. So I put them into the computer, and the computer said, okay, every 87 days when we took those measurements, we'll have a time interval. So we've got 87, 87, 87, 87, 87, 87, 87. So after 700 days, if we do a graph of the world going around and a graph of the combined magnetic field going around, take one from the other, we come out with this difference graph. I call it the sunspot graph. And after 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 of these, it looks like we get 3 positives and 3 negatives, and that is the 11-year sunspot cycle, because we know sunspots come and go every 11 and a half years if we look at the sun. So I looked at the graph, and I saw a few problems coming here, because I could see here, if we look at the shape of this, we've got M, M, V, and then we've got a sort of crown, and a spiky crown. So I thought, if I can find out that pattern, where it is, they must all begin again, because it's the same pattern. So I looked and looked and looked, and after 187 years, they all start off together. There we get the crown, the crown, the crown, and so on. The M, the M, the M, and the upside-down crown, and so on. And then I noticed something quite strange. I noticed these, although this was 700 days, 700, 700, 700, this one was 787. This one was 787. There were anomalies in the graph. And when I started to reconcile these anomalies, and that took me some time, like about 2 years to figure it through, I realized that the sun, although it should be positive at the top and negative at the bottom, the equator should be neutral. But what I found was that it's actually warped. It's like an old record. It got broken on the way here today, I'm afraid, but that was an old pop record. I think it was You Are My Sunshine or something like that. Now what we know is that they call it the neutral sheet. The neutral sheet is warped. We know that, the physicists know that, the astronomers know that. What this graph tells me, which nobody knew, is that every 187 years, that neutral warp moves. Because the graph tells me that after analysing it for 2 years. And after another 187 years, this one moves again. And after another 187 years. And in fact, so now we have 4 variables. We have the pole, the equator, the world, and the neutral warp. So when will they all be back together? Well, the answer to that is 18,169 years. But what did it mean? So I took another look. Well, what it means is that something's interfering with this neutral warp on the sun. We would expect the warp to follow the red line, but expect the equator of the sun's magnetic field to be neutral along the red line, but we know it's warped and tilted. And if we look at the warp and the tilt, I know these cycles every 11 and a half years are being interfered with along the length. They're being interfered with here, 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 and here on my graph. And when we have a look at the sunspot cycles itself over the centuries, we can see that the sunspot amplitude is going up and down in sympathy with this neutral warp. So I thought, well, that's interesting, because if that warp's moving, when will they come back together? What's actually happening? So I had a look at the warp then, and I started off with the warp as it is, and I put another one on top, and I said, okay, what happens if the warp moves every 187 years, little bit by bit, like that? It's moving 187 years, like so on. And what I discovered was that, the magnetic field of the sun, as this moves here, see these arrows? If we put them on top of each other, those are the arrows showing the direction of the magnetic field, that way, that way, that way. If we move them like this, over 187 years, we see the magnetic field of the Earth, of the sun, reverses. It goes from negative to positive. Now, I can calculate how long that will take simply by putting those the bits that interfere on together. So in other words, these are the bits that interfere here, and I'm saying, when does the black bar hit the next black bar? When does that black bar hit that one? And it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20. It's 187-year cycles. That's 20 multiplied by 68,302. That's 1,366,040 days. And that was a number worshipped by the Mayas of Central America. Now, do you see the problems? Okay? This is a mosaic sun shield from Monte Alban in Mexico. It's a sun shield. It has 4 arrows. It has 85 golden loops or sunspots, and it has 11 pendants. 4 times 8 times 11, multiplied by 365.25, comes out to be 1,366,040 days. So now you know what you're up against. We know what we're up against. These guys weren't the chimpanzees flying around in trees eating bananas like the archaeologists tell us. These people were smarter than we are today. And if we look at the sunspot graphs, we understand why civilizations rise and fall with sunspots. Because we know sunspots affect fertility. We know how they affect fertility. They affect the particles coming off the sun. That affects the brain. That affects the production of hormones. So every time we get a sunspot cycle, the pharaohs died out. The early Greeks died out. When we have a maximum, we have a pyramid maximum. The Mayas died out in AD 750. The Incas died out in 1530. All because the sun failed their fertility needs. There were no babies being born. Not only were there no babies being born, but when that magnetic field reverses, when that neutral warp reverses, what happens to the sun? Well, we can see what happens. If the sun's magnetic field goes that way, if it twists on its axis like that, the Earth turns on its axis upside down, and we have a pole shift. Now, of course, that doesn't happen every time. These are magnetically coupled. If that moves that way, that moves that way. If that moves that way, that moves that way. It's like a compass needle. If you've got a compass, it follows the magnetic field of the Earth. So we know the Maya, we know from that mosaic sun shield that the Maya knew the correct number for the sunspot cycle because they encoded it in that mosaic sun shield. And we need to ask, why did they worship another number 520 days longer? 1,366,560 days long. And they measure their calendar from the year 3113 BC. Because they knew in the year 3113 BC, 5,000 years ago, the magnetic field of the sun reversed. They know that. And the planet Venus reversed. The Earth did not reverse because we're further away. But they called it the birth of Venus. And that's why Venus now is rotating upside down. And it's very slow because it used to rotate that way quickly. But when it got turned upside down, it slowed down. One day it will stop and start turning the other way again. So they called it the birth of Venus. But I began to suspect as the books came along. Before we do that, I'll just show you Machu Picchu. Machu Picchu, we all know it's in the sky in Peru. And what you probably haven't seen is that, if you've been there, is that all of the windows are bricked up. There are no windows at Machu Picchu, except in the observatory. All of the windows are blocked up. So why build a window and block it up? Melatonin, the jet lag hormone, is maximum at 3 o'clock in the morning when it's dark. And 2 guys, Pierre Pauly and Riegelson, 2 Americans, doctors, wrote a book in 1999, The Melatonin Miracle. And they said not only does melatonin affect fertility, but electric fields decrease fertility. So if you're in Machu Picchu and you want to get rid of the electric fields, what do? You earth bond all of the stones in the building to short circuit the electrical energy to ground. And this is why all the stones at Tiwanaku in Bolivia and in Peru have these copper straps in the concrete, in the enchased blocks. So during the Inca minimum, they had a sunspot minimum. And when we have sunspot minimums, we have a mini ice age. When we have a mini ice age, We have less evaporation of the water from the oceans. So why didn't everybody in the world die out when we had a sunspot minimum? Because around the equator, around Mexico and Peru, either side of the equator, they had less melatonin and less fertility. It was a sunspot maximum, so we had more X-rays coming off the sun, so we had more spontaneous fetal abortion from the X-rays. X-rays are dangerous if you're pregnant. We had a sunspot minimum, so there was less rain globally, all around the world. But in equatorial regions, it was more crucial. So that the people around the equatorial region had famine as well as drought. Okay, who cares? Who cares? Well, this, as I said, this stuff is very, very important. In 1967, a British biologist, Janet Harker, wanted to know, how does a cockroach know when it's midnight? How can it get out of bed at midnight, run around for 6 hours, and then get tired again and go back to bed? So what she did was, she got a cockroach on an electron microscope, she put it to sleep with a little bit of chloroform, she cut its head off with an electron microscope and a scalpel, she put a grid on top of the cockroach with 100 little grids in it, and she got a little soldering iron, and she burnt a hole in one of the squares and put its head back together. Next day, got up at midnight. Next day, she got a different cockroach, and she burnt out the next square. And she did this over and over again, and eventually she reached a part of the brain which, when she burnt it out, it didn't wake up at midnight, and it didn't go to bed. It just ran around continuously. So she said, that must be the biological clock. She said, how can I check? So she got an Australian cockroach, and she flew one in. And she put his clock in the English cockroach, and she put the English clock in the Australian cockroach, and they both went to bed at the opposite time. So she said, it must be the clock. And then she said, I wonder what will happen if we put 2 clocks in one cockroach. So she put 2 clocks in one cockroach, and every time they got cancer and died. Okay, so let's have a look what's going on. Here we have the sun. The sun's giving out radiation, don't forget. And there's 4 patterns of radiation. This diagram shows the pattern 1, 2, 3. In other words, this particular month, number 4 was burned out. So we have this rhythm, this beat, a 1, 2, 3 beat. 1, 2, 3. So this sperm and the egg, they come together, and the sun is showering 1, 2, 3 on this particular baby, on this particular fetus or zygote. This sperm, as it enters the egg, and it starts developing and dividing its cells. And the baby starts developing cells as it's radiated by this sunshine with a 1, 2, 3 beat. The cells grow, the cells divide, more cell growth. The hormone systems develop. The hormones then feed a signal back to the biological clock. And the biological clock says, 1, 2, 3. Good, it's great. And it compares the 1, 2, 3 from the hormone system with the 1, 2, 3 from the sun. And it says, are they together? Yep, great. Okay, the sun goes around again, and the sun says, more cells. So the cells divide, and they go around, and there's no problem, great. And the organism grows a bit bigger, they get more hormones, more cells, and it grows and grows and grows. So we have a parity checker in the brain, the pineal gland, to make sure that they're both, we don't want that. We want them both together, the same code, because we know we've got a healthy baby. What happens if we change the code? Look at this situation. We have the same code coming from the sun, 1, 2, 3, but now you've got a carcinogen coming into the system. Coffee, tobacco, any carcinogen that changes its metabolic rate. Now we've got 1, 2, 3 from the sun here, but the carcinogen's going, hey man, this cigarette's making me go really quickly. And the other one's going like that, and they say, and what happens is this comparator doesn't switch off the system. And what happens is we get a cancer loop forming. And so we get cancer. The cells can Divide, multiply, divide, multiply. They're trying to stop what's happening, so they keep on making more and more cells. And so that's why we're getting cancer. Now, doctors know that chemotherapy only works on 1 in 4. Well, of course it works on 1 in 4, because you've got 4 types of people. If we could synchronize the chemotherapy with the radiation that organism requires, then it would be 100% effective. So that's how important it is. And if we look at the sunspot cycle every 11.5 years, we know that influenza viruses mutate with the sunshine, just like the cold sore, just like the fertility and the hormones. And we know from studies carried out in the UK in 1957 that flu is associated with schizophrenia. So we know the sun is affecting the birth at the organism at conception. That's affecting the baby's brain, and that is resulting in schizophrenic behavior. So, of course, it's very important. Now, so we know the Mayas were very clever. The Mayas were also aware that we're very much more complex than how we appear to be. For example, we have 4 bodies, not 1. We have the physical body, we have the intellectual body, the brain, and we have the emotional body, the heart, and we have the spiritual body, the aura around us. Now, about 4 weeks ago, I discovered how gravity works, and it's because of all this which gave me the insight to understand that. And really that came from understanding the difference between the spirit and the soul, which we'll come on to shortly. Now, the Mayas understood that Maya means illusion. It's an ancient Indian Sanskrit word that goes back 20,000 words. It means illusion, because they believe what we see is not what we see. Everything is inside out, back to front, and upside down. We think we see with our senses, but we don't. And if we look at the spiritual teachings, for example, what we're told is that God is light. God is electromagnetic energy. In the Bible, Genesis says God created light. But in the Bhagavad Gita, the Hindu holy book, for example, it says God is light. The Buddhists believe Buddha was enlightened. He was light. So we don't have to start changing the rules. We don't have to think we're very clever. And in fact, if you think you're clever, you won't get any of this work into your heads at all. You have to stand back with humility and say, I'm completely stupid. And it's the only way we can make discoveries. And indeed, that was how I solved out the gravity enigma just a few weeks ago. And I'll be talking on gravity during this symposium this week. Now, if we look at the scriptures again, the reason I got onto the spiritual aspect, by the way, was because when I started to decode the Mayan pictures, it all became quite clear what they were trying to tell us. If you remember earlier, there were 2 numbers, the sunspot cycle number and the number which was slightly bigger, the birth of Venus number. The sunspot cycle, just to go over it once more, was 1,366,040 days, but which the Maya knew of because they put it into the sun shield. But they worshipped another number, and they documented it in the ancient bark books, the Dresden Codex, for example. And they referred to it as the birth of Venus. So I'm thinking at this stage, it's when Venus turned upside down, which is true, which is like every 3,740 years, 1 million days. But on the last page of the Bible, Jesus says in the book of Revelation, I, Jesus, am the bright and morning star. The bright star is the bright star at night in the dark sky. And the morning star is the morning star, which are both manifestations of the planet Venus. It's not a star, it's a planet. Sometimes, I've got some diagrams coming up in a minute. I'll go into that in more detail in just a few moments. Just getting back to God, what is God? God is electromagnetic energy, accept it. The Bible also says God made man in his own image. And it seems that God can do anything except grow, because mankind can't grow beyond a certain size. It might be 5 foot 10 inches tall, it might be 18 inches wide. But we can only grow to a certain limit. If we want to grow any further, we have to throw a piece of ourselves away and create a baby. Then that grows. So if an apple tree wants to grow, it has to throw an apple away. The only known mechanism in the physical world, which is where the physical body lives, is to sacrifice a piece of ourselves, and we begin to grow. So God can do anything, it seems, except grow. Well, I was always taught that God was love and God was good, so the only thing better than God must be more God. But God can't grow. So that must be very frustrating for God. So I thought, well, how about if I was God and I threw a piece of myself away? How would that work? So, Okay, I've got them. I was just looking for some blank. No, I haven't. Here's a half blank one. I'll use this one. Okay. Let's say God in the beginning is 1,000 volts. Electromagnetic energy. God is like 1,000 volts. So he wants to grow, so he knows he has to throw some of himself away. So he throws 50 volts away. And he goes... So what we find is E equals mc squared. What we find is, now I know you don't like formulas, there's a little one. If you can't remember it, Einstein equals Maurice Cotterell squared. Okay? He's a lot smarter than I am. So, here we have 1,000 volts, which is God. And God threw a piece of himself away, which went across the equation in the beginning. Now, whenever you go across an equation, if this is 1,000 volts and God throws away 50 volts, then this mass, this is a physical world, this is everything in the universe, the mass must be opposite what God was because it's gone across the equation. It's very simple. So it's minus m. And this is the speed of light squared, which is 300 million. That's a big number. So when you squash E, when you throw some E away, you get a big bang, which is the atom bomb. And this is how the atom bomb works. Throw some energy away, squash all the atoms together. The bang you will get is 300 million times bigger than what you started with. And the mass, everything in the physical world, is opposite what God is. So what have we got in the physical world? Well, we've got overhead projectors, we've got cups, we've got shirts, we've got human beings. And we know everything in the physical world is opposite God. So if God is God, everything in the physical universe must be the devil. It must be. There are no other ways of looking at it. And this must be hell. And it is hell. And I'll prove it to you in the next few hours. And this is why everything is illusion. Now what happens when God sacrificed a piece of himself in the beginning here, we had the physical world is created. So we have light in the beginning. That light, the 1,000 volts, creates God. We get the Big Bang and we get the physical universe, which is the stars and the planets and everything else, are created. But we're not very bright. We're chimpanzees. And we've not got very much current flow going around the body, and we haven't got very much of a brain intellectually. But with evolution and millions and thousands of years, we develop into ostensibly intelligent human beings. And when our brain reaches a certain voltage, we rip another piece of, don't forget, we are minus 5 volts. My heart is pumping the blood is developing voltages across all my neurons. So my brain develops a voltage, say minus 2 volts. That minus 2 volts rips another 2 volts off God. And that little 2 volts attaches to me in my mother's womb. So I'm now 2 volts negative and 2 volts positive, which is 0 volts. Now I'm a human being. Half devil, half God. See? Clever, isn't it? And it gets better. So, let's have a look at the rules of the physical world. You see, the physical world says, if I have $1 and you have $1, and I give you my $1 and you give me your $1, we have $1. Which means we can't get something for nothing. But the intellectual world, for example, isn't like that, because if I have an idea and you have an idea and we exchange them, I have 2 ideas and you have 2 ideas, and it doesn't cost anything. So we can double our intellectual wealth at no cost. Now, if I love you, my voltage goes up. If I hate you, my voltage goes down. If I love you, then my voltage grows from 2 volts to 100 volts. Then when my energy leaves my body, it can leave this physical hell, escape the Earth's gravity, and it goes back to God, who becomes 1,100 volts, because he's got my soul. So God has grown, which is good. So what we find is, if we love each other, our soul voltage grows, and we go back to God, and God grows. If we hate each other, our soul voltage falls, and it can't get off the earth. So if it falls from 2 volts in the beginning, don't forget it was 2 volts, if I hate you and it goes down to half a volt during my lifetime, then it will come, that half a volt will look for a half a volt baby. It's not going to look for a 2 volt baby. It's going to look for a half a volt baby, which isn't as strong as a 2 volt baby. It's not as clever as a 2 volt baby. It's not as happy as a 2 volt baby. So we're in hell. Abandon hope, all you who enter, says Dante. And the problem is, as we know, it's easier for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to get to heaven. And the reason is, if I'm bought rich and I have servants, I say that floor's not very clean. Clean it. And the person on the floor says, why are you kicking me? What have I done to you? And the person on the floor is hurt. And when the heart suffers, the heart purifies. And when the heart purifies, the voltage increases. So the person on the floor starts to go to heaven every time he's kicked. But the person doing the kicking starts to go to hell because his voltage goes down. And if we look at the information from the Mayas, they tell us that there are 3 worlds. We have the God world, the physical world, which we see around us. We have the soul world, which is where all souls go after they leave the body. Some souls go to the paradises, where they're not really bad ones. These aren't too bad at all. So they get purified in the soul world after 3,740 years in purgatory, where the heart is purged of sin. All these pictures have been put down by the Mayas, and I'll show you some of them. They go back to God, and God grows. So mankind is a conduit, a channel for making God grow. The impure souls go to the underworld, and if your voltage is half a volt, you might come back and be a cockroach, a half a volt cockroach. Or you might be 1 millivolt mosquitoes. So you come back as a ball of mosquitoes. And this is what this happens. This is why you get flocks of birds. They all turn at the same time, because it's the same soul. And bundles of midgets, and they all move at the same time. They stay in the ball. Because it's like throwing a brick into a car windscreen. You might have 1 volt to start off with, but when you throw the brick, it can shatter. You don't just have a nervous breakdown in the physical world, you can have a nervous breakdown in your soul. And that can go back as 100 souls. And this is why the Maya say everything is illusion. I had a friend who's 80 years old who lives in England, and we went on a walk one day, and he said, I can't understand, Maurice, why the Mayas say this is illusion. And he picked up a flower. He said, look, that flower, it looks like a flower, smells like a flower, feels like a flower. What's the problem? Well, I didn't want to hurt his feelings. So that night over dinner and 3 bottles of wine, I said, Ron, do you remember that conversation we were having? He said, yes. I said, look, that flower was a biological system. It had a voltage on it. It had God in it. The soul, it had a soul attached to it. In 2 weeks' time, the plant will die and the soul will be released. If it's pure soul, which it isn't, because it's only a flower, it has to get to mankind to be that higher voltage, then it will escape the Earth's atmosphere. If not, it will come back and the flower, in 3 weeks' time, may be a worm, because it will attach itself to a voltage which is equal and opposite to itself exactly. And it might be a worm for a month, and its voltage might go up, and it might come back as a mouse, and it might come back as an eagle, and its voltage will keep going up. And this is the problem. As our voltage goes up, in one lifetime we become more intelligent and more loving, because, don't forget, the body is the devil. And what the Indians tell us, it's in the Bhagavad Gita, is that if we have a look at the body, they compare it to 5 horses that represent the 5 senses of the body. And the reins are the intellect. The brain is the driver, and the soul is a passenger. And it's up to the intellect, the driver, to hold back the horses from running away. You see, we've got the eye, the nose, and so on each horse. The eyes, the nose, the ears, the mouth, the touch. If we use the mind to hold back the body, then we'll have a peaceful ride on earth. So what happens is our voltage goes up as we evolve. We're here for thousands of years, millions of years we live for. We've been back many, many times. You guys especially at this conference have been back many. There are old souls and young souls. You are all old souls or you wouldn't be here. Not my words. We get to a certain voltage, but as we get to a higher voltage, we have more money and we're healthier, and we start to abuse the people around us. And so the voltage goes down the next time, and it's like being in an elevator in a tall building. You go from the 5th floor to the 2nd floor, 9th floor to the 3rd floor, 50th floor to the 12th floor to the 11th floor, and so on. And we can't get to the roof, to the helicopter to take us to heaven. And this is why we're in prison. This is a prison. This is where we live. And people say to me very often, well, how do we love our neighbor? Because clearly if you love, your voltage will grow. That's the key. Jesus had the key. And I said, well, it seems to me that the biggest problem to me in this world is that people have likes and dislikes. And the problem is, if you dislike something, if this is normal, if you like, if you dislike something, you could hate it. Disliking is a first step to hate. And that's the problem with the world, is hate. So it seems to me that we have to get rid of dislike, get rid of this disliking thing. It's no good to us. But the only way to get rid of disliking is to get rid of liking. Yeah. And we have to get rid of liking. It might sound unpleasant, but we have to. So he said, well, I can't get my head around that. What do you mean? And I said, well, look, okay, take red peppers. Red peppers make me feel sick. I don't dislike red peppers. Lots of people enjoy red peppers. God made red peppers for all of humanity, and we're all different. And God's not stupid. If you think God would make something that's inherently bad, then there's something wrong with the way you're thinking. God is clever. And I know God is clever. It would be a slight on his intelligence to suggest otherwise. So I don't need to dislike red peppers. I avoid them. Simple. I don't like red peppers. I don't like bananas. I enjoy them or avoid them. It's simple. And if we get rid of this liking and disliking, then you can't dislike a person because you know God created them. God loves everybody, all 6 billion of us. You know, why do you think, some people think God's stupid. Why do you think God went to all that trouble to make us all different? Earth signs, fire signs, water signs, air signs. It could have been like Henry Ford, made them all the same. Spare parts would be cheaper. Who would make 6 billion people all different? You see, with 4 types of people, 4 astrological signs, we all argue all the time, which is great. Because think about what it would be like if we all agreed. You know, isn't that a nice picture? Yeah, that's a wonderful picture. Well, I wouldn't do another one, would I? What if somebody said, oh, I've had a bad day, I'm going to commit suicide? Well, I agree. I'm going to commit suicide. And everybody commits suicide. So God would stop growing, wouldn't he? So God's got to make sure that we all disagree. And so this is an important part of the mechanism of life on earth. Which is why we'll never go to another planet. I mean, this is your domain now. If we go to another planet which doesn't have a sun like ours, we're all going to be the same. If we use artificial insemination and fertility pills, we're all going to think the same. And sooner or later, we'll all kill ourselves on that planet, whether it be Mars or wherever. So we have to find a sun which has 2 magnetic fields, where they rotate at different speeds, where they produce the right hormones to give us 4 types of star sign, to all make us disagree, so we can all be happy. Easy, isn't it? So how are you... Now I know, I figured all this out because I was rich in this life because I had an education. I could think this stuff through. That's when I say rich, because I was able to do this. I don't mean money. But I know next time, if I'm not very careful, I'll come back as a poor person. Now Jesus says, give all your wealth away and follow me. It's difficult, isn't it? You go to the bank manager and say, I'd like to take all my money out because I'm giving it away. Difficult, isn't it? You know. So I think, well, okay, what's the next best thing? If I write all this information down, the next time I come back, if I read it, I'll come back rich and go to heaven. Because I'll know what to do and how to live. And I'll know that this is hell. Now, I could write it down in pictures, like this Aztec calendar, and explain how the world ended on 4 previous magnetic reversals in the last 18,169 years. This is the Aztec calendar. Or I could encode it in numbers. Don't forget, a picture's worth 1,000 words, but some stuff like 26, 37, 1366040, 18,160, very difficult to put that in a picture because the language will change. You know, when the Spaniards invaded Mexico, they stopped speaking the Quichumaya tongue. They started to speak Spanish. So the numbers might change, the language changes. So I've got to make it more permanent. So I need to encode numbers of the sun's rotation are very important, 26, 28 if you're on the Earth, 37 or 41 if you're on the Earth, 96, that's the number of magnetic sunspot cycles, 97 if you're going to count the one that includes the 18,000-year cycle, the number of magnetic shifts, 20 if we're talking about magnetic reversal, the 1366040 if we're talking about rises and falls of civilization, and 1366560 if we're talking about Venus. So we're going to go down to Mexico now, and we're going to have a look at the Temple of Inscriptions at Palenque, because it was there in 1952 that the archaeologist Alberto Ruz took the paving slab off the top of the pyramid here. He scratched out the mortar filling from those holes, and he found a staircase running down inside the pyramid here. 26 steps. He then turned to his right along a landing and went down 22 steps. There was 4 more inside the tomb at the bottom, which he later discovered. So 26 altogether. Again, there was a brick wall at the end with a stone box. And in the stone box, there was a pearl in a seashell. The pearl represents the planet Venus and rebirth in ancient civilizations. And some of the numbers the ancient civilizations used, like 666, the mark of the beast in the Bible, they used those to convey the information which we're talking about. And they also used 999. Well, if 666 is hell, what do you think 999 might be? Heaven. Yeah, it's a good idea, isn't it? Okay. Well, why would the pearl be in the cinnabar? Well, the pearl is Venus, and the atomic number of cinnabar, the powdered form of the liquid metal mercury, is 80. It means it's got 80 protons in the middle. So the pearl in the seashell is number 81. Now, I know that because when I was studying Tutankhamun, he had 143 pieces of jewelry inside his bandages. He was number 144 of the 144,000 that go to heaven, the purified ones in Revelation. So the pearl in the cinnabar is number 81, which is 9 nines. 9999999999. So immediately, has this tomb got something to do with heaven? The door to the tomb was triangular. They demolished the stone chest, which had 11 jade beads, 3 red painted shells, and 3 plates. And they entered the tomb in 1952, July. And Alberto Ruz noticed that there was 5 beams holding up the ceiling, 6 pillars on the wall, that the sarcophagus lid here had 2 corners missing. And of course, what's missing isn't missing if you're a Mayan. And what's not missing is missing. And the sarcophagus inside had one of the corners chopped off. So that was the sarcophagus lid. It weighs 5 tons, 12 foot long, 6 feet wide, solid limestone, so big they can't remove it from the tomb. And the body was kept in this sarcophagus, which had a missing corner at the bottom here. And the carving on the sarcophagus was very popular in the 1960s because Eric von Däniken said it might be a guy in a spaceship. But this was going to be much more than any of those things because the triangular door represented a journey into the mind. When we examine the pyramid, just going back to that picture we saw a few moments ago, the paving stone at the top, there were 2 holes in one corner, 2 holes in the other corner, 2 holes in the other corner, 2 holes in the other corner, and there were 2 plaster heads on the floor, showing the man in the tomb, Lord Paikal. That was one of them, and that was the other one. There were 3 clay plates in the stone chest, 3 red painted shells, 3 sides to the door tomb, 3 jade beads. The man in the tomb, the bones of the man in the tomb, had a jade bead in his right hand, a jade bead in his left hand, and a jade bead in his mouth. And he had a necklace around his neck with 3 levels on it. There were 4 steps down to the tomb itself. The man had 4 jade rings on his left hand, 4 jade rings on his right hand. There were 4 pairs of holes in the slab at the top, and there were 4 concrete plugs or limestone plugs holding down the lid of the tomb. There were 5 pyramid landings, 5 temple stairways, 5 male skeletons, 5 ceiling beams, 5 sarcophagus sides. There were 6 temple pillars, 6 sides to the tomb, but there were no more 6s in the temple at Palenque in Mexico. The numbers 666 were missing. At least they were missing until we had a look at the necklace around the man's neck. And when we have a look at the necklace, we find out we have 13 beads, which is 6 plus 7. We had another 13 beads, which is 6 plus 7, and another 13 beads, 6 plus 7, which gives us the 3 missing 6s, 6, 6, 6, and throws up 3 7s, 7, 7, 7. There's another 7 there, but we're still missing a 7. Here we have 15, which is 7 plus 8, which gives us the last 7 and the first of the 8s. Now the Maya used a bar and dot system to count. 5 was a bar, 1 was a dot was 1, so 5, 6, 7, 8, 5, 6, 7, 8, 5, 6, 7, 8, 5, 6, 7, 8, which gives us the 5 8s, including the 1 from the 15. There were 9 steps at the bottom of the pyramid, 9 pyramid levels, 9 steps at the top, 9 paintings on the wall, and 9 codes down either side of the lid. If we now take 9 of the Maya calendar cycles, they measured time in cycles of 20-day periods, not weeks, they didn't use 7 days, they used 20, 260-day periods, 360-day periods, 7,200-day periods, and 144, that's where their counting stopped. If we take 9 of those, 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 we come up with 1,366,400 560 days, which is the birth of Venus number. Now, this Venus number, as I explained earlier, is slightly different to the sun shield number. And that's because if we look at Venus here, the morning star, it's rising. So as the sun rises that morning, we will see Venus on the right. But 112 days later from the Earth, Venus will actually be on this side of the sun. So the only time we'll see it is when it sets in the east. And then we'll see it left behind as a bright evening star. And when I went to Guadalajara, I saw this shrine in the temple there. And of course, Jesus said in St. John, "I have said to you that I will go away and come unto you again. I, Jesus, am the bright and shining morning star." And there we see Jesus with Joseph and Mary with the twin planets, Venus, as a morning star and an evening star, with the bright star of Bethlehem above on his head. Now, once I started to decode all this stuff, I had another look at the carving on the lid, and it became quite clear that these people were geniuses. Of course, it was easy to just put down the sun in this design, and two dragons, which represents the sun, and a woman being licked by the sun god here for fertility. There we have the sun god in the middle of the Aztec calendar, and we also have carvings in Mexico of the sun, trying to tell us that the sun was killing us. The sun's rays was causing the babies here to die, and the babies had a circle on their chest representing the sun. Solar babies are here. So we have babies, and we have the sun, which was killing the babies because of lack of fertility and because of X-rays. And the sun god, his tongue's out, and he's licking the female to make her more fertile. So yes, clearly we could have a picture like that. We'll be taking a break in just about 10 minutes. I just want to show you one of the miracles before you have your whatever. The next picture we could say, I haven't even started yet. We could say that this particular picture, if we colour in different parts of that design, represents the age of water by this lady here, Chalchihuitliqui. She was a goddess of water who wore a jade skirt. So maybe this is Chalchihuitliqui in the bathtub, holding a lily leaf in her left hand. Well, if that's Chalchihuitliqui, the goddess of water, who ruled the age of water for 3,740 years before the world came to an end because of the flood, maybe this eagle could represent the Ecatl, the god of wind, when the world was destroyed by hurricanes. And maybe this stylized representation, could represent Tlaloc. There's lots of carvings like this in Central America, with his distinctive teeth and his ears and so on. He was the god of rain, but volcanic rain, when the world was destroyed through volcanic eruptions. And as we've already seen, this could be the sun god, when the world was destroyed by the sunspot cycle. And if we look at Mayan mythology, perhaps the lid tells us other stories of where we go when we die. One of the stories says that there's a place called Tamawanchan where the babies go when they die. So maybe this area here on the lid represents Tamawanchan, the place where dead babies go when they die. Maybe this area represents Adam and Eve. Of course, one of them's missing, so that's not so certain. There are some corn seeds down here, so the archaeologists tell us. Maybe those corn seeds represent the paradise called Chincalco. That's where women went who died in childbirth. Perhaps this is a woman dying in childbirth going to that paradise. So this particular picture tells us about all of the other paradises. Now, the Popol Vuh, the book of the Maya, it begins and ends with the same words. The Popol Vuh, the original Bible, as it is called, cannot be seen anymore. The book was written long ago, but now it is hidden to the searcher and to the thinker. Very cryptic beginning. And it says exactly the same thing on the end. The Popol Vuh, as it is called, cannot be seen anymore. The original book was written long ago, but now its sight is hidden to the searcher and the thinker. Now, I want to just briefly do an experiment with you to show you how the brain works. If I asked you a question, that's a picture, a jigsaw puzzle picture of an English country garden. It's not very clear because the projector's awful. And I said to you, what's so unusual about that picture, or different, or special? What would you say to me? Well, the brain doesn't like questions like that, because right now it's going one way, it's saying, what's he talking about? What's so special? I don't understand the question. What does he mean? Let me ask you another question. Here is a picture of an English country garden. What's so special about that picture? Pictures are missing. The pieces are missing. Aren't you clever? You don't know how clever you are. Because you didn't see what was there. You can only see what's not there. You don't see me. You see somebody who's too tall, or too short, or too fat, or too thin. Or who talks too fast, or who talks too slowly. You don't see your son or your daughter. You say, why can't you wash the dishes and help your mother? Why can't you cut the grass and help your father? We only ever see the bits that are missing. So I want to leave all of this information so that when I come back in 3,000 years' time, I can find it again. So how am I going to do it? When I went to Palenque, I said to the guide, where are the two pieces off the corners? He said, I'd never noticed. And I can understand why, because this is so big they can't get it out of the pyramid. But the archaeologists are really switched on. They've made a replica in the museum just around the corner. But they fixed the corners. Because they weren't there. So if you go to the museum in Palenque, you'll see a fiberglass model of this, just 100 yards from the pyramid, and the corners are perfect. But when you go into the pyramid, you'll see they're missing. What's not there, and what is there is missing, because I understand the Mayas. Now, this is why now you'll understand my frustration with this projector in a few minutes. If we look at the pattern on the corner there, this is the lid. I call it the lid of Palenque. It's grey now because if it's not grey, the black lines interfere with the picture, so I had to turn them grey on the computer. Without the computer in 1985 and the colour photocopier, none of this work would have been possible. And I said to myself, if they're not missing, I'll just put those on top of each other just to show you that I'm not cheating. There's nothing there. I just coloured in a few colours and laid them on top of each other for now. But what I want you to look at is the corners right now. This corner, we've got a sort of star shape made up out of dots. And this one, we've got like magnetic lines. So I thought, if they're not missing, they must still be there. So I've got to use a bit of lateral thinking and find them. So what I did was, I made a transparent photocopy, put one on the other, and overlaid them. And what we see is that the pattern is restored. Can you see that? I found the missing corner. Now, can you see it? It's important. Little crooked. That's okay. It's very important. Just a second. 0.1 of a degree, and you won't see it. Very, very critical. And you'll see just what geniuses we're playing with. I can't see now because this is burning my eyes out. And I can't find my glasses without my glasses. I'll try anyway. We're coming to a break in a second. Can you see that? Yeah. Okay. Now, the trouble is then, the ones at the bottom are not completed. They're skew whiff. They're out. So if I put them there together, you see the ones at the bottom are completed? Can you see that? They're completed now, the loops. See? And now we can see a load of pictures down that border, if I try and straighten them up slightly. But they're not very persuasive yet. So let me turn those up like that, so where it should be. Okay, do you see the picture of the tiger? 3/4 of the way down, the tiger's head. I'll show you them a bit clearer now, because there are several steps. So we started off colouring in the corners. Then we took a mirror image and put the corners together here, but notice this corner was not together. So then we separated them so that this corner was together, but this corner's no longer together. And when we did that, we coloured in the edges down here, put them both back to back, and we came out with 4 patterns. The head of a bird, a human face wearing a blindfold, with butterflies on his lips, something that looks like a tiger, and something that looks like a dog with a blindfold. But these are very inconclusive and not persuasive. So we need to do a little bit more research. I'll just blow them up again. There's the bird face. See the eyes, the nostrils, the beak. Then we have the human face with a butterfly shape on each lip. Now I know this. This is the god of ice and the god of... This is Venus. Venus was the god of ice in the morning, the ice crystals. Clahuis Kapaltikutli, his name was. And he wore a blindfold, and the blindfold was made out of the skin of a sacrificed victim. I know what I'm looking for, but you won't at this stage. I understand that. And we have the sun, the jaguar, and the sunspot cycle. And we have Venus in the morning, in the evening, Xolotl, the dog who was blind. He wore a blindfold and carried bones in his teeth. And if we look at the borders around the lid, we notice that all of the borders, when we put them together, has got these composites of the Mayan gods. But we have to line up these dots every time, exactly. And also another picture, when we put the borders together, is a picture of a bat. And the Mayans worship the bat as a god of fertility. So, if we take a look at that, and we say, okay, we've got some pretty nondescript pictures around the outside. It could be anything. It could be something from the grocery store. You say it's a dog with bones in its teeth. Who cares? Fine, okay. I'm going to have to ask you to look at this one now a little bit more closely, because what's so special about that picture? Now, that is a difficult one. Apart from the missing corners, of course. Now, so I said, well, I don't know because I've never seen one before. So, okay, I'll start here. And this is what I did for 10 months. I started there, and I thought, what could that be? I thought, I don't know, I've never seen one before. I thought, what could that be? Never seen one before. What could that be? Never seen one before. Eventually, I got to the last bit, didn't I? I had to start at the wrong end. And I said, what's that? That's a bit unusual. I've seen one of them before. That's a man. It's a man's head, that. Isn't that interesting? So I thought, well, I've not seen one of those before. It looks like he's got a banana on his nose. I've never seen a man with a banana. Must be a mistake. How can I get rid of the banana and make it perfect? Because we are born to make ourselves perfect. Easy. Don't need rocket science to work this out. I could get some scissors, but I haven't got any. It's 1,000 years ago, remember? Tipex. No Tipex. I've got this, haven't I? I've got that. I wonder if by using that, I could get rid of the banana. Yes, I can. Now, all I've got is 2 guys with their noses touching. Can you see that? Are you sure it's important? You can see it, okay. Let's have another look at the picture. What's so special about that picture? He's got a banana on his nose. What are we going to do? We're going to get rid of it. How are we going to get rid of it? We're going to use 2 acetates. So I'm going to selectively colour in these pictures now. And there are rules. It's like painting by numbers. They're very strict rules. I can fill in an area with colour, but I can't go over the line. That's cheating. So all I've done there is I've filled in a few colours, because it took me 10 months to find this picture of 10 hours a day. So I've just put some colours in there, and the same on the bottom. But it's just a load of rubbish. I've just filled in some of the areas. Now I know this part is the epicenter of this particular picture. There are more than 100 pictures in here, moving videos. This is the first one. Now what I'm going to do is, I've been told to remove the banana off his nose. There's the banana. There's his head in grey. There's the banana on the end of his nose. So I'm going to put another one now on there. Like so. And there we have the bat god. We have his eye, his nose, his mouth, and these dots line up. Line those dots up and then remove the banana off his nose. We have the bat god flying towards us. That is the bat god for the Mayas. Can you see that? And we have the bat god flying away from us at the lower part of the picture, which is there, with his wings open this time. And here we have 4 dashes. Dash, 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 which is 20. And we have 5 dots on the top, which is 25. This tells us there are 25 pictures in the border code. There are 20 corresponding to 25 pictures in the main part of the carving. So the bat god tells us that there are 25 codes in here. It's an index, a list of contents. Once we match those contents, we can find the hidden picture in the middle of the lid. For example, these were the 2 heads we saw at the bottom of the tomb earlier, Lord Paycal. And everything is crucial. This crack here is very important. This circle here is very important. Everything is for a reason. Lord Paycal has a high hairstyle here and a low hairstyle there. So you know this because these are in the tomb. So let's have a look at, once I've found the 25 pictures in the border code, and I've found 25 pictures in the middle, I was left over with some border codes that I couldn't reconcile. I found the bat in the border, I found the bat in the middle. I found this picture in the border, I found that picture in the middle. And after I'd gone around them all, I couldn't find a home for these pictures in the border. This picture says, small guy here, hands on his chest, bare feet, closed eyes, he's got a halo on his head, a sunspot magnetic loop. He's just sitting there, lying there. That's the man in the tomb. Got to be. His hands on his chest. He's got a bird on his head. It's the eye, the beak, and his wings are open, like a bird coming down. We've got the sun god from the Aztec calendar. He's got a magnetic loop on his head. He's the sun. And we've got 2 ear shapes here. So what could it mean? To see the man in the tomb, look for a bird on his head. To see the man in the tomb with a bird on his head, look. To see the man in the tomb with a bird on the head, who is the sun god, put the ears together, opposite each other. So they're giving me instructions. So, there's the ear shape here. As I say, I'm sorry about the projector. I'm trying to move it so that you can see the best part. There's the ear shape there. This time the colours are more complex, but you can see the painting by numbers technique now, how critical it is to stick to the areas and not to spill over. It's just rubbish. There's nothing there right now. But I've been told to put the ears opposite each other. So first of all, I'll line them up to start off, just so you know there's no cheating. There's nothing there, just the original design with a few colours in it. I've been told to turn them over, put the ears opposite each other. There's one ear and there's the other. There's the 2 ears together now. And look for a bird on the head. Well, I can't see a bird on the head. But now I know there's an epicenter to every picture because I'm getting used to it. The epicenter for this picture, if we draw a cross right across them, is that little red dot. See this dot? So I'm going to put that red dot, now the ears are opposite, slide them across so the little red dot is on top of itself. Now I know it's an epicenter, so then it says, look for a bird on his head. So now I have to rotate it And there we have the bird on his head. A little bird with a chain in its mouth. And there we have underneath the bird a picture of the man in the tomb. Let me show you a clearer one. I've taken the grey away now and made it white. Can you see that? Now, he's got a bat mask over his face. I'll show you the bat mask in a few minutes. I'll keep you out of your waiting. This is Viracocha from a tomb in Peru. And here we see Viracocha with a bat mask over his face, with 4 sets of feathers on his head. Now, of course, he lived 300 years before Lord Paikal. But in his tomb, we find this little man, a golden man with his arms up, with corks on his head, on his hat, for flies, to keep the flies away. This little man is across Lord Paikal's face in the tomb at Palenque, and we see he's got a pure heart here. It's going back to the Palenque model. So now we see the small man here with his arms in the air, with his pure heart. And on his head, he's got some numbers. If we look closely, if we look at those numbers, we've got 144000. That's backwards, that's a Maya. And backwards, 1440, a Maya 0, Maya 0. He's got 144,000 on his head. And in the book of Revelation in the Bible, it says those with 144,000 carved on their heads will be the ones who will go to heaven when the world is saved. This picture can only be seen when each of these acetates, you call them mylars, I think. We call them acetates, so forgive me. It can only be seen when this one is turned at 7.2 degrees and this one is turned 7.2 degrees. When the difference between them is 144 degrees, 14.4 degrees, we get this picture on his forehead, 144,000. When they're turned at 7 degrees, not 7.2, 7 and 7, just 0.2 of a degree, the man with a pure heart, his heart completes and becomes pure. It's a heart shape. And so, we're told, if you want only those with a pure heart at 7 and 7, 7 degrees and 7 degrees, will become, we see now, that doesn't say 144,000. It's a bit gobbledygook. This one says 144,000 because I've moved it from this position. From 7 degrees to 7.2, the number only appears at 7.2, so only those with a pure heart will go to heaven. We have to take a break there so they can change the audio tapes in the background. But the amazing lid of Palenque, that carving you saw, has over 100 stories like this. It tells us what heaven is, what hell is, what life's all about, why we're born, why we die, why this has to be. And, okay, let's leave it there. We saw the pictures earlier how when we put the acetates at 7.2 degrees each, we had Lord Paikal dying with a bird on his head with the bat mask across his face. Well, when we turn the acetates another 7.2 degrees, we now see Lord Paikal with a bat god. Here, there's the bat god, his 2 eyes, his head, and his arms. It looks like a 747 coming into land. And we have the god of death with his cloak. It's like a skeleton. It's 2 eyes, his nose, his mouth. It's like a chimpanzee with a black hat on, with a cloak. This is the god of death on his mouth. On his head, we have the god of the north, Yeotl. And Yeotl has 2 skeletons, one in each hand, and he's standing on the guy's head. And there's a hole in Lord Paikal's head. But the reason the hole's there is to allow for the soul to leave the body on death. The Chinese did the same thing. This is a jade suit, a jade burial suit from China. And this is from the tomb of Prince Li Sheng, who came after Qin Shi Huangdi, the first emperor of China in 220 BC. And what we see is that there's a hole in his head to allow the soul to release. And his head, the platelets on his head contain the entire superscience of the sun, which is what we were talking about earlier on, how the sun radiates radiation which impinges on the earth, and all that stuff. Also, these two dragon heads, these two baby dragons, are very important because we'll find those on the Holy Grail if we get to it later on. Now, this picture of Lord Pacal dying, we had the two pictures of Lord Pacal earlier, the two heads. That was one of the heads, and the other one had a crack in the nose bridge, which I said was very important. Well, here we see the crack in the nose bridge area here. And what this is telling us, it's like breaking an egg. We've got, Lord Pacal's got this skeleton in his mouth like two hooks, and he's got Lord Tezcatlipoca Yeotl, he's the god of the north, on his head. And he breaks open like an egg, if you can imagine an egg snapping. And his forehead opens at the crack that was on the head on the floor that we saw earlier. Now, you say, why haven't these pictures been seen earlier? Well, that is the acetates without the colours. So you can see the problems of why this could never have been done before we had the computer and the overhead projector. Now, the next sequence in the pictures is this one here. Oh, sure, okay. The next picture, when we rotate the acetates again, is we see the hole in the head here of Lord Pacal's skull. His skull is a black area now. These are the bones, these are the eye sockets here. Out of the crack in the nose bridge area comes this maiden, and she opens her legs, she points to her forehead with the compasses of the Freemasons, and she laughs and smiles. Out of her womb comes a baby with a pearl in its mouth, with wings. That's its back legs and its bottom, and there's its two arms. And the baby spits out a pearl, and the pearl becomes two solar babies. There's two babies there that we saw earlier, the twins, Venus. You see that, I'm afraid that's the best we can do, but do you remember the two babies were from Mexico with a solar mark on their stomachs earlier? That's what these two are. And these tell us that they're joined at the navel by a star. So this is Venus. So this tells us that when Lord Pacal died, his soul, there we see his soul coming out of his head. We've got his eye, his nose, his mouth. There's his chin. And the bird is now carrying his soul. The bird's flapping its wings and carrying the soul out of the head. And in its mouth, the bird has the pieces of the jade mask. So there's an awful lot going on in this picture. This tells us that when Lord Pacal died, his soul went to heaven. It was carried by the Quetzal bird, the baby bird that was on his head, and he was reborn as Venus, the twins. So this tells us that Lord Pacal was Jesus. He was the rebirth of Venus. I am the bright and morning star. And this is why we have the pearl in the seashell. He was Venus in the heavens. Just like it says in Revelation, I am the morning star and the evening star. And again, if we just have a look at the sequence there, we see the skull, the picture's getting worse and worse as his body degrades, and he goes to heaven and is reborn. And other pictures on the amazing lid of Palenque tell us this is the Earth Mother, which is Coatlicue here, with the twins on Earth. So what we see is the two twins on Earth sucking and holding the nipples of the Earth Mother. Coatlicue had 1,000 nipples, and she had a necklace of hands and hearts. She was a god of birth and rebirth for the Maya, the mother goddess. And so we see that when Lord Pacal was reborn as Venus, the twins, he came back to Earth. And this is how we can reconcile instinct, because how does a bird know how to build its nest? This is a nest of swallows or martins. And they know how to build a nest because there were martins in the last life. How does a dog know how to round up sheep? Because he was a sheepdog in his last incarnation. And if we look at, this is a Magic Eye 3D picture that we see in the popular magazines. And if you stare at them, you can see other information. This has got the pyramids in this area here, but you can't see it until you stare at it. So somebody asked me a question during the break. How did they do this if they didn't have acetates? Well, the Egyptians have tried to tell us about this. Here we see Nefertiti with one eye and one eye missing from the museum. It's in Berlin now, actually. And she's telling us we can only see half the information. The same with Akhenaten, the so-called father of Tutankhamun. He's got one eye missing. It's telling us we can only see half the information. And we've got a left hemisphere and a right hemisphere. Now, we need acetates because we're stupid. We have to put one here and put them on top of each other. But the Mayans were so intelligent, they opened their left eye, like the magic eye picture, and stored the picture, just like this one. Then they opened their right eye and stored the picture, and then the brain overlapped the two sides. So they didn't need acetates. We're the ones who need acetates because we're stupid. Now, can the brain do this? Well, the brain can do this. There's a report of a girl in England called Vicky Wilmore, and she was 10 years old, and one day she went to she had a headache, she got up in the morning, went to school, and everything she wrote was upside down and back to front. The only way the teacher could read her essays was to put a mirror to the side of it, and she could read it, and it was perfect. But it was the exact opposite of what it was the day before, and it stayed like that for 3 years. And so she fell off the chair while watching Manchester United, banged her head, and everything went the right way around again. And she's been fine ever since. So we know the brain can invert things and turn it upside down with no difficulty and regurgitate the information. And this is how, for many years, when I was doing the work from initially the Mayan prophecies in 1995, I thought, well, no human being could do this stuff. No, it's impossible. It must be a genius. And I considered the possibilities, and then I thought, maybe I've been making a mistake because, I'm saying that the Mayas were very intelligent, but maybe the Mayas weren't very intelligent. Because could it be, I have been trying to tell people a story that goes something like this. For example, once upon a time in Israel, 2,000 years ago, everybody walked on the water. And everybody turned water into wine, and everybody healed the sick with their bare hands. And I thought, that's not really true, is it? But one man did those things in Israel 2,000 years ago. Perhaps there was one man among the Mayas who did that stuff 1,250 years ago. And then once I thought of that, and I started to look at the stories, many more stories, and unfortunately, you're not going to see very much because of the setup. But that was the mask covering the man in the tomb. And there are actually 3 dots on here, 1, 2, 3. There are 2 dots there, darker ones, 1, 2. There's a dot there, 1. There's a dot here. There's a bead in his mouth. So I thought, well, could these be markers of alignment, just like the amazing lid of Palenque? Was the amazing lid of Palenque the Rosetta Stone, which taught me the rules? Once I'd found out the rules, could I now take other artifacts, turn them upside down, and line up the dots, like that, and come out with the bat god? Now, again, it's not very clear on here, but there's the eye, the nose, he's got a bead in his mouth, and these 3 dots underneath are aligned. If I can just see, I just can't see it because the resolution is so bad. But let me try again. Can you see the bat god in the middle area with his 2 ears sticking up? And he's got his tongue out, and he's got a big black bead in his mouth, and he's got a cloak, and under the bottom of the cloak here, he's got 4 triangles, which tells us he ruled the north, south, the west, and the east of the sky. Now, as I move these around, we come out with lots of other pictures. For example, when I line the 2 black dots up there, we come out with a small boy here with 2 eyes. He's got a helmet on. There's lots of pictures. These are very complex pictures. Let me try and get you another composite. Let's try that one. That's the same picture, but a bit brighter. Can you see the small boy now? He's got a feathered hat on. There's his eye, his nose, his mouth. He's got his tongue sticking out of his mouth, and there's actually a snake coming, a V, like the tongue of a snake. On his forehead, he's got the god of sacrifice, which is here, with 2 earrings, one on either side, with an eye, and he's got a lotus blossom on his forehead. Beneath the lotus blossom, we have a Buddha figure, cross-legged, praying. Now, this equipment is so bad, I feel embarrassed. I'd rather say, come and stand behind me and look at this on the screen, because you'd appreciate it. I'm fighting a losing battle here, I'll tell you that now. But these are beautiful pictures, and this tells us that this boy wore a feathered hat in his previous life. And he's telling us he came to the throne at the age of 9. He was known as the feathered snake to his people. He was the eagle in the sky, the soul, and also the snake on the ground which shed its skin and reincarnated. He's telling us that he was Tutankhamun, the guy with the feathers and the snake on his forehead. He's telling us he was Buddha, cross-legged, praying. He's telling us he was the Lord of sacrifice. This is the picture at the back. And when we start, there's a sketch of the picture I'm trying to explain. And even that, again, it's very fuzzy because of the resolution of this thing. But here we have the Mayan god of fire and sacrifice called Sekrety, also known as Xipe Totec to the Mayas. And he has a brazier on his back, and they used to put people in the brazier and cremate them. So Sekrety wore a helmet to keep the heat off his head. Here we see the small picture of the boy is wearing a helmet. It's telling us he is Sekrety, the small boy Sekrety, the god of sacrifice. And it's telling us he was a feathered snake. He's got the feathered snake coming out of his mouth here. He's telling us that he used to pray cross-legged beneath a lotus blossom. And he's telling us that he was a feathered snake of Egypt, Tutankhamun. Tutankhamun means the living image of Amun, the son of Amun, the son of God, the child of God, God's son. Now, I'm going to have to miss a load of this out because we're just not going to get to it. It also shows us that Lord Paikal was a god of goodness with wings. And there we have him. He's actually getting up out of the tomb there. We can see his feet here, his 2 feet, his legs, his 2 arms. He's got a bird's head and a bird's beak. He is the feathered snake, Quetzalcoatl, as I mentioned earlier. He's got 2 wings here. This is the tomb itself. This is the shape of the tomb in Palenque when you walk in, the limestone beams. He's getting up out of the coffin and he's bowing to the audience beneath a lotus blossom. He's got the wings of a bird at the front, the claws. He's got the angel's wings, and he's got the head of the bird. And if we turn the angel of goodness upside down, we come up with the bat god, which is the angel of badness. So all of these pictures can be reversed. What's good becomes bad, and what's bad becomes good. That doesn't mean that bad is good or good is bad. It means if you think about the worst day of your life, when you were on the floor crying because you'd failed an exam or you'd failed your tests or you lost a child, you thought that day would never end and you were in tears and in pain. But now you survived, and today you're in this lecture and you feel so much happier today looking back on that awful moment. If you look back on the nicest moment in your life, the sun was shining, you were walking through the fields with a new partner, the birds were singing, and then you find yourself here. Not quite the same. So what was good makes you feel bad, and what's bad makes you feel good. So the good becomes the good, and the bad becomes the good, and the good becomes bad. When we look at decode the Mosaic mask, we come out with the God of the north, the God of the east, the God of the west, and the God of the south. And in Revelations, it says, I saw 4 angels coming from the 4 corners. And I saw a 5th angel, and the 5th angel said, do not hurt the earth, nor the sea, nor the trees, until we have sealed the servants of our God in their foreheads. And I heard that the number of those that were sealed were 144,000 of all the children of Israel. And that's telling us about the 144,000 on Lord Paykal's head. Now, Giles Healy was an American, and in 1947 he was married to a Lacandon Indian in the rainforests of Chiapas in Mexico. And eventually he won the confidence of the Mayas, and they took him to their temple in the jungle. And there were drawings on the temple, on each of the walls of the temple. And this is one of the drawings, originally painted, now faded very badly. And the archaeologists who say that these people swung about in trees, as I mentioned earlier, and ate bananas, they say that this must be a group of dancers dressed up as alligators and monsters. Okay. Now, we know better than that because we know, again, the resolution's awful. Can you see this cross here? Can you see that? Maybe it's the way I'm looking at it. There's a cross there, and we all know what the cross is, don't we? The cross represents the sun. God is the sun. That's the cross. That's where the Christian cross comes from, the sun, the 4 sectors of magnetic field. So let's try our decoding technique on the sun. And I know that this picture is about Jaipitotek or Kamashkli. Jaipitotek was like Jaitikutli, we saw earlier, with a brazier on his back. He was a god of sacrifice and skin and foreskin. When victims were sacrificed by the Aztecs, they took their skin off and put it over their heads like gloves. And Jaipitotek was the lord of those who had been sacrificed, and also the lord of hunting. He was a god of hunting. So if we colour a few areas in, there's the cross of the sun. Start off with the sun to see what we've got. Put one on top of the other to start with, just to check again. So there's nothing there except the original picture. Use the sun as a centre of rotation and swizzle it around, like so. And there we have a man called Jaipitotek. And we see that he's got I'll put a clearer one on in a second. He's carrying 2 sticks. He's got a foreskin hanging down between his green skirt. He was a god of fertility. So we see his skin, a god of skin and sacrifice. He's got a vessel on his head where he carried the seeds of fertility. And his chest is formed by 2 stags with horns. They've got 3 horns each. There's one stag's head pointing that way. There's the other stag's head pointing that way. And they've got horns on. So this is a god of fertility, Jaipitotek, the god of skin and foreskin, who was also the god of hunting, hence the association with stags. Now, the stag is associated with the sun because it sheds its antlers every year. And Jaipitotek is associated with the sun. Now, here's another one. And this one, when we put the transparencies on top of each other, we come out with a picture of Chimalma. Now, there we have the washerwoman at the back. Just a moment. Here we have the washerwoman at the back with her arms folded. She's got a skirt on. She's got one of those rags the Mexican wears on their heads. And in front of her there's an enormous head there. And the guy standing like that looking at us, with a big head and his arms back like an arrow. Now, she's got twins in her belly. Now, Chimalma was the mother of Quetzalcoatl in Mayan mythology. Chimalma got pregnant when she swallowed a jade bead through an immaculate conception. Chimalma gave birth to the twins, the bright and morning star. When she'd given birth to the twins, she was walking through the woods one day and she came across a warrior, Mixcoatl. He fired arrows above her head to frighten her so that he could sleep with her. He fired some beneath her legs, and she bowed her head to avoid the arrows that he fired. And so we see Mixcoatl shown as an arrowhead bowing down to convey part of the story. So here we have the story. This is all from the tomb. This is all from Lord Pacal, don't forget, of Mexico. So there we have the transparencies again. So again, we're being told that the guy in the tomb was born through an immaculate conception. Now when we have a look at the next picture from the mural at Bonham-Pack and put them on top of each other, we're told that the guy in the tomb was born in a stable, surrounded by animals with horns. And this picture shows Kamashli, the god of hunting. And we have 2 midwives here, one on either side, restraining the mother of Kamashli. she's being restrained in the center. Out of her womb comes an animal with 2 sets of horns down here. So she's giving birth to the stag with 2 sets of horns, or 2 stags, and she's being licked by the stag on her head. This tells us that this guy who was born through an immaculate conception, you can see it a bit clearer there, hopefully. So here we have one midwife. There's another midwife. Here's the mother of Kamashli in grey with her legs open. Here we see the head coming out with brown horns and pink horns, the 2 stags. And here we have the stag in the stable licking the mother during the painful process of childbirth. Now this is at 9 degrees, the 999. And this is the picture without the colours. The next one, I'll just show you, go straight to it. Now the 2 stags shown in grey here are holding up Jaipitotek, and his legs are crossed and his arms are crossed, and he's holding 2 wooden sticks. His face is like the lion, the mane of a lion, and the lion in ancient mythology, it was associated with the sun. So this tells us that the 2 stags who are holding up this guy by the elbows with 2 wooden sticks tells us that this is the man who died on the cross made of 2 wooden sticks. So here we have the 2 stags. Can we see that? Okay. And then the final picture in this sequence, we have the 2 stags applauding Jaipitotek, who was half stag, half man. Here we have the 2 stags applauding him. Jaipitotek comes out at the end of the performance with his 2 sticks and bows to the audience. And that's the end of this show. Because these are like plays. They have a beginning, a middle, and an end. And they all come out at the end and bow. Just like the man in the tomb, the mosaic mask, we saw him at the end bowing. It's a sequence throughout the whole production. And this is at 66.6 degrees, those transparencies. That's the number of the beast in Revelation. He who has understanding, let him count the number of the beast. It is 666. Now, here's another one from Bonham Pack, another of the paintings. And again, this is where the archaeologists went badly wrong. This is where they took the wrong turn. They walked into this chamber and they said, gee, look at all these guys. They've got blood dripping from their fingernails. These must be prisoners. And these must be the kings who have captured them and cut their fingernails off. Wow, these people were animals. Well, it's not quite like that. If we take one of the drawings here, and then we see the blood dripping out a bit better there. Now we take the sketch. This guy's lying back. And those are the so-called kings with animal skins over them. If we put one, whenever we get these dots here, these are epicenters, 1, 2, 3. On his arm, again, the resolution's no good. We've got 2 dots there. These are epicenters for different pictures. So when we put one on top of the other, like so, what we see now is that it's not war. What we've got is this guy's washing this guy's hair, this guy's washing this guy's hair, this guy's having oral sex with this guy. So it's making love, not war. So it's the entire opposite of what they... But they don't want the archaeologists to figure these. Archaeologists don't believe in God. You don't want archaeologists going to heaven, do you? The last thing you can afford when you're writing this stuff down is to allow people who are profane to get to heaven. And going back to what we said earlier, why didn't God make us all look the same? Like the Model T Ford concept. It makes sense. Because if we all looked the same, your kid would look like next door's kid. And you might love next door's kid by mistake, thinking it was your kid. So then you'd get to heaven by mistake. And that's not allowed. So God said, let's make everybody look different, because then you'll love your kid. And there's nothing in the Bible that says you've got to love your kid. The Bible says you've got to love your neighbor's kid. And say anything about your own kid. And if next door neighbor's kid looks like you, we got a real problem. We saw the mask there, the feathered hat, And then we have Tutankhamun with his wife Ankhesenamun on the back of the golden throne in his tomb at the Valley of the Kings, wearing the same hat. And Tutankhamun, of course, the son of God, was the feathered snake to his people, just as Lord Paikau was a feathered snake to his people. Tutankhamun has 26 bands on the front of his headdress, and he was the feathered snake. And then we have the sun, just like the Mexican sun shield, which has got the 1366040 encoded into it. This is the eagle and the snake, the feathered snake, which is God. Now, Lord Paikau, the name derives from Pascal, which is a Catholic word for Easter, because Jesus died at Easter. And as we start to investigate all of the evidence from all of these civilizations, we start to get a clearer picture of what was going on. Now, James Churchward was an American, and in 1927, he was an explorer. He was working for the British as a secret agent in Brahmaputra in Tibet, in India. And he went to a monastery, and the monks in the monastery showed him some ancient tablets called the Nacal tablets, made by the Nacal people 25,000 years ago on the lost island of Lemuria. And the monks said to him, look, this is what the tablets mean. That's the sun, and the sun changed its radiation, and it heated up the land, and the land sank beneath the waves, and 25 million inhabitants of Mu, or Lemuria, were lost. And if we look at the sun, we see the warped neutral sheet of the sun for the first time. Now, these tablets are 25,000 years old. Here we have a snake on the face of the sun representing the neutral warp on the sun that we saw earlier, the model of the record. If you remember, we had the record there with a warp on the side of it representing the neutral sheet. So it seems that not only could the feathered snake represent in a simple way the soul in the air, the feathers, and the snake on the ground, it looks like they were trying to tell us the feathered snake relates to the neutral warp on the sun. And all of these people associated with the feathered snake, here we have Tutankhamun with a ring of sunflower seeds. The sun is the feathered snake. And what we're told is that if we calibrate or if we change the energies in our body, we have chakra centers here, and these chakra centers all spin at different rates. The ancient Sanskrit Indians described them as wheels. We now know them to be the endocrine centers, like the pituitary, the pineal, and so on. And Madame Blavatsky, a Victorian esoteric seer, noticed that the petals, the base chakra, for example, had 4 petals. The sacral chakra center had 6. The solar plexus, 10. The heart, 12. The throat, the pituitary gland, 16. And the crown chakra, 96. And if you add all those up, it comes to 144. The brow chakra has 96, and the crown chakra 1,000. So if we add up all of those centers, it's 144, and multiply them by the top one there, it's 144,000. And ancients believe that if we can get the energies going up the body, then we create a halo. Those are the chakra centers. And if we can get the energy going up the body and up the spine, we get energy coming out of the crown chakra at the top. And this is why in ancient pictures they're often represented with halos, different sorts of halos. And only Jesus has the halo with the cross of the sun behind his head, because only Jesus is the sun. You'll find the saints have different types of halos because they're not as pure as Jesus was. And what we find is that when men ejaculate sperm, they lose a great deal of protein, because sperm is about 99% protein and zinc. And one of the problems with reincarnation is if you have children and you don't go to heaven, then you come back as your children's children. because the DNA is the same and the voltage is the same. So if you don't have children, A, there's no body to come back to, so that makes it difficult to reincarnate, which is good, because you go to heaven. And the thing is, this is why priests have to be celibate. This is why Moses said in the Bible, take the foreskins off the babies. Circumcision, which stops them masturbating, stops them getting rid of the sperm, because as soon as you get rid of sperm, all the energy in the body goes to the gonads to make more sperm, instead of going up the spine to make voltage to go back to God. In the same way, women who love their baby send all their energy to their child, and instead of the energies going up the spine and amplifying, they go down, and it stops them getting to heaven. Earlier we saw the importance of the number 9. Tutankhamun's tomb has 99999 seals, and he was born in 9 coffins. And here's a picture of Tutankhamun going to heaven in his burial chamber at the Valley of the Kings. Here we see Tut meeting Nut, the goddess of the night sky. So he's going to heaven. And then we see Tut as 2 twins, embracing Osiris, the twins, the morning star and the evening star. When Tutankhamun died, he went to heaven. He was resurrected in heaven as the twins, which means Tutankhamun must be the same, another reincarnation of Jesus. And if you go down to Peru, what you'll find is that the ancient Incas had many stories. For example, one of them says, by Cieza de Leon, a Spanish writer in the 16th century, he said, before the Incas had ruled or even been heard of in these kingdoms, the Indians relate a thing more noteworthy than anything else. They say there suddenly appeared from the south a white man of large stature and authoritative demeanor. This man had such great power, he changed the hills into valleys, and from the valleys made hills, causing the streams to flow from living stone. They called him the maker of all things created, prince of all things, father of the sun. He did more wonderful things, giving being to men and animals. By his hands, very great benefits accrue to them. This is the story the Indians themselves told me, who in turn told it to their children, handed down through ancient times. They say he travelled along the highland route to the north, working marvels as he went. And they say they never saw him again. They say that in many places he gave men instruction on how they should live, speaking to them with great love and kindness, telling them to be good and do no damage or injury one to the other, but to love one another and show charity to all. They called him Tiki Viracocha, and they built temples to him. The huge statues in the village of Tiahuanaco in Bolivia are held to be from those times. After a long time, they saw another man who looked like the first, but they don't mention his name. They have it from whoever they talk to that he could heal the sick with his bare hands and restore sight to the blind by words alone. Thus he was loved by everyone. Working miracles, and by his words, he came to Canas near the village of Kasha. The people rose up against him and threatened to stone him, but he sank to his knees and raised his hands to heaven. They then saw fire in the sky, which seemed all around them. Full of fear, they avoided him, and they asked for his forgiveness. They regarded this as a sin for doing what they did to him. And they say further, leaving the place where this occurred, they came to the coast, and there, holding his mantle, he went forth amidst the waves of the sea and was seen no more. And as he went, they gave him the name Viracocha, which means foam of the sea. Now, there are lots of stories like this about the 2 white men who walked through Peru performing miracles in olden times, around 500 AD. Viracocha means foam of the sea. When I lived in Cornwall many years ago, I put my Wellington boots on and walked in the water because I couldn't understand why they would call him foam of the sea. And I walked in the foam of the sea, and I thought, well, what's happening to me right now? And I stood between the foam of the sea and the shore. And then I went from the shore and I went into the water away from the foam of the sea. And when I was in the foam of the sea, I thought, well, right now I'm in touch with the earth beneath my feet, the air, the sun above my head, and with the water. I'm in the foam of the sea. I'm in perfect balance with everything, the earth, the fire, the air, the water. If I move to the land, I am no longer in perfect balance with all four because I've lost contact with the sea. If I step into contact with the sea, I lose contact with the land. So I'm not perfect. The only time I'm perfect is when I'm in the foam of the sea. So what were they trying to tell us? The Indians believe that the cow is sacred because it gives holy milk. And the foam of the sea is clearly a metaphor for the perfect human being, he who is in balance with nature. And the Indians, in worshipping the cow and Lord Krishna, which means Christ, the Christos, because Lord Krishna was born and he was said to be like all of the other super gods. I'm trying to connect. I've got to cut out large chunks of this lecture because, as I say, it takes 16 hours in a good day. But the Indians believed heaven to be a milky ocean, the foam of the sea. And that's where God lived. And they believed that when we died, we went to the foam of the sea. Now, in 1988 in Peru, there were lots of reports about some tombs that had been discovered. And one of the tombs contained a figure of the man in the tomb in the guise of a crab. Now, the crab is an animal that lives on the land and in the water. The crab lives in the foam of the sea. And so, in 95, the first book I had published was The Mayan Prophecies. And I did all the sunspot stuff, how they understood how the sun was affecting life on Earth. Although I couldn't understand how they could have done it, that was it. I thought, well, they must have been very clever. But then I started to think, well, nobody could do this sort of thing unless they were superhuman. So I thought there has to be a connection here. Maybe everybody, as we mentioned earlier, wasn't clever in those days. As we were talking about, had I made a mistake in saying that everybody in Israel were clever in the year 0? Well, it wasn't. It was one man. And in the same way, everybody wasn't clever in Mexico. It was one man, Lord Pascal, who was clever. And, of course, Pascal is a Catholic word for Easter, which tells us that Lord Pascal was associated with Easter, as was Jesus, who died on the cross at Easter. So I started to have a look at Viracocha. And he was the Peruvian, I call them super gods, this holy energy that comes to earth periodically. And there were two super gods discovered in Mexico, one at the top of the pyramid and one at the bottom of the pyramid. There was Viracocha and Viracocha Pachacamac. Viracocha Pachacamac was the god of the world. So one arrived in about 350 AD, the one at the top, that was Viracocha Pachacamac. The one at the bottom of the pyramid, believe it or not, was Viracocha, foam of the sea. So you say, well, how could they build a pyramid in layers every 50 years, and the guy at the top be at the bottom, and the guy at the bottom be at the top? Well, of course, the first will be last, and the last will be first from the Bible. And this is what they're trying to tell us. In fact, there are tunnels connecting these levels together, so they put the top body at the bottom, and the bottom body at the top, again, to convey all these messages. And all of the treasures of Viracocha are contained in his tomb at Saipan in Peru. For example, the number of the super gods we saw earlier when we had the matrix 1 1 1 1 1 2 2 2 2 2 3 3 3 3 3 all the way down, and then at the bottom we had 1,366,560. That was on level 9 when we added up all of those cycles. Here we see we've got 9, the straps of the coffin are held together with 99999, which again is a number of the super gods, which tells us that the men in Peru were, like Lord Pascal, a super god. And there is Viracocha Pachacamac. And that's a picture you saw briefly earlier on with a bat mask over his face. Now the bat brought death. And he's got feathers on his head. So we have the bat mask and we have feathers on his head like Quetzalcoatl. Quetzalcoatl was the feathered snake. The feathers and the snake of Egypt, Tutankhamun, were the feathered snake of Mexico, Quetzalcoatl. Also the feathered snake of Peru. We have the same theme coming through, whereby the feathers epitomized the spirit in the sky, and the snake represented the body on earth, or the body on the ground. And if we look at all of the treasures from the tombs in Peru, we start to see all of the super science of the sun, I call it. Here we have the sun, with the north pole of the sun here. Don't forget the north pole. This north pole here goes around every 37 days, but the equator goes around every 26. And once we start doing the calculations, we can work out different cycles of the sun. And here we see the four sectors of the sun, the positive, negative, just as we have on here. These are all treasures from the tombs of the bat god, the god of death, the god of darkness, the solar wind. There's a solar wind, which we got this is from Mariner 2 spacecraft, this plot that we saw earlier. As the sun rotates, every 7 days we get 7 days positive radiation, negative radiation coming from the sun, 7 days positive, 7 days negative, 7 days positive. This was discovered by Mariner 2 spacecraft in 1962. And if we take a plot from the sun, using a computer, we can see the protons coming off the sun for 7 days, then we see the electrons coming off for 7 days, then the protons, but because these two are going around together, but then they lose synchronization with each other, what we find is that after a month, this one, the blue one, has slid backwards by 90 degrees against number one. So as it's moving backwards, it's like a mixer, and we don't see field number one, we see garbage. So that month, all we get is garbage. What we should get without the North Pole is 7 days negative radiation coming off the sun towards the Earth. Then as the positive sector goes by, we should get 7 days positive. Then as the sun spins around some more, we get 7 days negative, because the sun is spinning all the time and it takes 28 days to go round. But what we've seen is when we have a look at the interaction, is that because the North Pole slides through field number one during a month, what we saw was, as they both go round, this blue one is going backwards through field number one. So during field number one, the radiation goes through number one and stirs it up like a spoon. So the radiation coming off the sun is number 2, 3, 4. The next month we go through the next quadrant. The radiation coming off the sun is 1, 3, 4. The next month it's 1, 2, 4, and the next month it's 1, 2, 3. So we have 4 codes of radiation caused by these 4 fields. These are pieces of jewelry which show the sun carved into 4 sections. That's not very clear, but it's black, and white there. So they're trying to teach us what I call the super science of the sun. And if we now look at the picture of Lord Paykal, and we look at the small man with the hat, I call this guy here, because he was found in the tombs in Peru, in Viracocha Pachacamac. There was 2 Viracochas, Viracocha and Viracocha Pachacamac, at different levels of the pyramid in Peru, at Saipan. And this, when they reconstructed it, with all the bits they found, they reconstructed this model of Viracocha Pachacamac, who they call God of the World. And he's got these feathers on his head. And in the tomb with him, with these small representations of this small man with a hat, and the small man has corks hanging from his hat. Because he's telling us that Viracocha is on earth in the place of flies, the place of filth. If we look at Viracocha now, and compare him to Lord Paykal, who came from AD 750, here we see the little man across his bat mask. He's got the bat mask across his face, so we can understand this Mexican picture now, because it's very similar to the one in Peru, even though there's 300 years between them. We see the small man here, with his arms in the air, and the small man's got a perfect heart. And the corks on this guy's hat correspond to the teeth on Lord Paykal's face. It's telling us that Lord Paykal was a reincarnation of Viracocha Pachacamac, the man from the tomb That's the bottom of the tomb. He was also a reincarnation of Viracocha, who came 200 years later from the top of the tomb. It's telling us it was the same guy. And Lord Paykal has the 144,000 carved on his forehead. And the 144,000, of course, was the number of those who go to heaven when they are pure. In the Bible it says, you'll know the ones going to heaven because they've got 144,000 written on their foreheads. That's in Revelation. So if you remember the two transparencies from earlier on, we put them on top of each other here. We rotate them like this. We saw the picture of the man with the bird on his head, which was there. And we saw the picture 1440, 1440 backwards, 00, 144,000. And the Bible says, you will know the ones going to heaven. They will have 144,000 written on their foreheads. That's what it says in the book of Revelation. You will know them when you meet them, the ones going to heaven. And here we have Lord Paykal of the Maya, the leader of the Maya, buried in the tomb in Mexico with 144,000, 144000, backwards 144000, written on his forehead. He's got a small baby bird on his head, which is a quetzal bird, brightly coloured feathers. And he's got the small man with a pure heart from Peru. And there's the small man with a pure heart telling us that the way to heaven, if you want to become one of the 144,000 here, you've got to have a pure heart. Then you'll become a bird, a baby bird, and go to heaven. So it's all interesting stuff, isn't it? Now, as I said, I'm actually going very, very slowly because of the equipment, because it's so bad. And what we know, briefly, is that Qin Shi Huangdi, the first emperor of China, of unified China, had two dragons. His emblem was two dragons, and the dragons carried the sun, or Venus. In fact, two dragons carry the twin planet Venus. And Qin Shi Huangdi, the leader of the Chinese in 220 BC, was shown as a stag carrying a pearl and an eagle and a snake, the feathered snake, Quetzalcoatl of the Mexicans. He was the eagle in the sky, like Tutankhamun, and the snake on the ground, on earth, and he was also a stag, and he carried the seed of knowledge. We saw earlier how Lord Paykal was a stag, and he bowed to the audience, and he had two stags applauding him either side. That was from the mural of Bonampak in Mexico. This now is from China, of a different time period. In Mexico we were looking at 750 AD. This is 1,000 years earlier in China, which tells us that the emperor was the stag and the feathered snake, which is exactly the same as Lord Paykal of Mexico. It's exactly as Tutankhamun, who was a feathered snake. So what we're being told is that all of these guys kept coming to earth. Jesus came to earth many times. He came to earth as Lord Krishna 2,500 years before BC. He came to earth. If we look at the terracotta warriors of China, I'll just digress slightly. I'm trying to take out chunks of the lecture to get to the points because we just won't have time. But Qin Shi Huangdi, the first emperor of China, lived around 220 BC, before Christ, and he built the Great Pyramid in Xi'an, in China. They say he was a tyrant, but he wasn't, of course. He was a reincarnation of Jesus, just like all the other super gods, I call them. One of the books I published, which isn't here, from 1997, called The Super Gods, showed that these people were gods who came to earth to teach us about spirituality. And they came several times. Jesus came back several times. First of all, he came in around 3000 BC as Krishna, the Christos, the Christ. And each time he left the same messages behind. Krishna came back 8 times. The 9th time he came back as Buddha. So we know Buddha is a reincarnation of Krishna. But the ancient archaeological treasures from around the world of the sun-worshipping civilizations of Earth We're talking about the Egyptians, the Peruvians, the Chinese, the Celtic people of Ireland. They all worship the sun because they understood that the sun created fertility on earth. Every time the sun goes round, every 28 days, females menstruate. And this is why the sun is associated with fertility. But of course, the North Pole is moving backwards. As that's going around every 28 days, the North Pole takes 37 days to go around once. So we're getting a mixing up of this radiation from the sun. And if we look at the shapes of these faces, the archaeologists say that the face shapes correspond to a different word in the Chinese alphabet. And if we look at the words, we come out with this phrase: focus the eye on the soldiers in the covered tunnels. These are the terracotta warriors at Xi'an. Read the meaning of the national Chinese characters differently. Use your mind to understand a story which spans from the beginning of time until now, a story about the sun and God. And if we look at the tombs and the layouts of the tombs at Xi'an, for example, this one as an example, what we see is that we have a chariot here, for example. This is a chamber number 3 at Xi'an, where the terracotta warriors were found in 1974. It's full of soldiers, and here's a chariot. I've just simplified the diagram a bit here. Now, the resolution's not good enough on there, but if we were to take that chariot straight out, the wheel would bang against the wall. So they're trying to tell us something. In order to get this chariot out of the ramp, up the ramp and out of this base, the soldiers' barracks, this is a barracks for the soldier. In order to get the chariots and the horses out, we've got to turn left. Otherwise, we're going to hit that wheel on the wall. And they're trying to tell us, if we look at it full of soldiers now, here's there's 4 horses and a chariot here. If we come out of the ramp and turn left and go left, that's what they're trying to tell us. These are the formation of the soldiers in the tomb, life-size soldiers, the terracotta warriors, in one of the chambers at Xi'an in China. And if we try to make sense of that and reconcile it, what we see is 2, 3, 4, 0. 2, 3, 4, 0. There are 2 soldiers here, 3 soldiers there, 4 soldiers there, no soldiers here. If we go counterclockwise, follow the chariot out of the underground chamber. 2,340 revolutions of the planet Venus, which is 584 days, is 1,366,560 days, which is the same number that we had in the Matrix from Palenque in Mexico. Lord Paycal at the bottom, we had 1,366,560 days, the birth of Venus number. Here we have 144. Here we have 0. There's no troops here. 2 rows of 10. 144,000. 144,000. 144,000. These are the ones who will go to heaven. In the book of Revelation, it says in the Bible, those with 144,000 carved on their foreheads will go to heaven. And that's why the picture of Lord Paycal had 144000 on his forehead. Now, I also went down to Bolivia. This is when I was doing Viracocha, and had a look at all of the archaeological artifacts in the museum. And there's a picture of Viracocha. This is a statue in a temple of the Kalasasaya, one of the temples. And this is a statue of Viracocha with a male in his right hand and a female in his left. And again, we can have a look at what that's trying to tell us. So that's the picture of Viracocha. We take the mirror image, of course, just like all of the others we've been doing with these They all use the same technique. So that's Viracocha. Take the mirror image of Viracocha. The instructions are all contained in this. Put one on top of the other. Excuse me. Okay, just a sec. Let's go back to that one. Viracocha has a picture of a male in his right hand standing up, and a picture of a female upside down, facing downwards, going down. If we follow those instructions, this is from Tiwanaku, the gateway of the sun, a picture of Viracocha, the sun god. If we follow those, take a picture of the man, which is there. So we start off in that position. It says, take a picture of the man. And these are instructions. Then take the mirror image. That is the mirror image. Then turn the woman, that's the female, opposite the man. Have a look at the picture. Turn one into a female, the opposite of a man. It's now a mirror image. Turn the female upside down. Put the female on top of the male. And now we see Viracocha with his tongue out, which was the mark of the sun god, and one eye open. And when we move the transparency slightly, his eye closes and the other eye opens, and his tongue moves to the other side of his mouth. When we move it back, just on this epicenter here, swizzle it back again, we lose this eye opens again, and the tongue moves to the other side of his mouth. This is telling us, if we stand in front of the gateway of the sun at Tiwanaku and close one eye at a time, we can measure the angle of the sun. And what they're trying to tell us is that the earth tilted on its angle because of the sun. In other words, whenever the sun changes its angle, the earth tilts on its axis upside down and causes earthquakes. And this is why the Mexicans believed that the earth would destroy itself on 5 different occasions. And we are now living in the 5th age of the sun. This is the sun shield of Monte Olban, which is in Mexico. Here we have 85 loops, 4 arrows, and 11 pendants. And if we multiply 4 by 85 by 11, we come out with 3,740. If we multiply that by the number of days in a year, 365.25, we come out with the same number of the sarcophagus in Palenque, 1,366,040. So, there has to be more to this than we imagine. So, if we put them both together like this, to start off with, I call these pictures Maya transformers, because they transform into other pictures. And we put them upside down like this, we come out with a picture of the gateway of the sun at Tiwanaku. Now, we can see the gateway at the top here, with this particular architrave is carved. And we see the reflection in Lake Titicaca here. And we see a triangle here, which will, when we put that onto the computer and flip it, it'll give us a Star of David, the mark of Judaism. Down here we've got a character. He's actually leaning down, looking at us like this. And this is the Mayan god called Xiaoticutli. There's his eye, his triangular nose, and he's got a helmet on his head. We saw him earlier when we saw the picture of the feathered boy with a hat. And we had the picture of Xiaoticutli leaning down with a vessel of cremation. They used to cremate people on his back. So this is from Monte Olban, Mexico. It's showing us a picture of Tiwanaku in Bolivia, which is thousands of miles away. And when we start to decode the sun shield of Monte Olban in Mexico, when we put one on top of the other, we see the Star of David here, there and there. This is one here. You can only do the other one using a geometric line drawing once it's on the computer. You can't actually see it on here. There's a picture of Viracocha, this one off the gateway is there, the one we've just had a look at. And here's a Star of David representing Judaism. And in here, the carving of Viracocha has a star in his mouth, actually in his mouth. And if we have a look at some other pictures from the sun shield of Monte Olban, we've got a square here which represents Viracocha, the Peruvian god Viracocha, and here we see Lord Pacal where the two interlocking circles, the Vesica Pisces, which is a mark of the fish or Jesus, we see Lord Paycal there regurgitating a pearl from his mouth. So he's bowing to the audience, as we saw him earlier in the mural from Bonampak. We saw him come out on stage at the end. The two stags were applauding. Here we see him again on this sunshield of Monte Olban with this distinctive hairstyle, regurgitating the pearl that was in the seashell at the tomb at Palenque, showing us he was been reborn. And here we see the brain of Lord Paycal inside his head. We actually see the different lobes of the brain and the different hemispheres here as he bows to the audience that we saw earlier. And if we look at the geometry, what we see is that each of these angles are 60 degrees, 60 degrees, 60 degrees, which is 666. But the other triangle, therefore, if it's the mirror image, they're telling us to do the mirror image here. We've got the gateway of the sun at Tiwanaku. Take the mirror image, we therefore come out with 999. So when we put one on top of the other, we come out with the Star of David. This is a story of the Star of David, or the Jew who reincarnated at Tiwanaku. And if we look at Lord Paycal here and the Star of David, then we had the Vesica Pisces inside the sunshield of Monte Olban. So we start to bring all these pictures together and we start to get more and more evidence which tells us that Viracocha, or the man from the tomb at Peru, Viracocha is foam of the sea, was the same man as Lord Paycal of Mexico and the same man as Jesus. And as we start to move the transparencies around here, now what we find is this is the head of a Jewish guy here. He's got like a headdress on. There's his mouth. He's got two eyes saying, come and listen, I want to talk to you. There's his right eye, his left eye, his nose. Above his head here we have a character embracing that square, and in the middle we have a little baby, and the baby has a square. That's the square of the Freemason. And the next picture we see, there's the baby. You can see the baby's head, his eye, his nose, his mouth, his shoulders. We next see the baby here with his arms folded with a cross, forming the Christian cross there. And then if we look at all of the different pictures here, the light created by the light, we come out with the Freemason compasses, the cross of Christ, and the square of virtue, which is, again, all worshipped by the Freemasons. And this tells us that all of these pictures of Freemasonry and purity, that we've been born here to purify our soul before we go to heaven. If we look at the mask again, there we see another pattern. He's got his two arms up like that, and he's holding his head like that, and it's the face of Jesus in the middle, and he's got the cross, the wooden cross across his forehead there. Let me point out his eyes. There's his right eye, his left eye, his tongue is out here, just like the Mexican sun god. This is the Vesica Pisces, the mark of Christianity. If we take a picture of that, that's the sketch we're looking at with his tongue out here. I'll go back to it in a second. Two crosses, his hands on his head. She's there. Can you see it? Again, it's a lousy projector, so this is giving us problems. He's got his tongue out like the sun god from the Amazing Lid of Palenque, and like the sun god from the Aztec calendar. And we notice that he's got loops around his head, and these are the loops from the sunspot cycle. And what we find is we have the entire Bible carved into this picture from Monte Olban, the sunshield of Monte Olban. And here, if we look closely, again, it's pretty awful. Let me show you the composite picture first. What we have is a bat here, with his eye, and he's on a cross. This is the cross of Northern Ireland, or the Freemason, the Red Cross. It's not just a two-bar cross, it's a special cross. And here we have Shaiti Kutli, the god of fire, with his helmet. They used to cremate people in his helmet, on his back. They set fire to them and burnt them. God of sacrifice and fire. So he wore a helmet to keep the heat off his head. We saw him earlier. Here we see his eye, his nose, and his two ears. Like he's got a hole in his earrings there. And that we can see here and here. So Sekrety is bowing down. He's got the brazier of cremation. That's this thing here. That's in yellow. And inside the brazier, we've got a sacrificed bat. Now, the bat was a god of death for the Mayas and the Peruvians. And his wings are stapled to the cross with 2 drawing pins. And he's hanging from the cross. Now, with a better projector, you could see that there. There's the head of Sekrety, the god of sacrifice, with his eyes, nose. Here we have the brazier itself. There's the cross going up there and around there, down there and around there. And the crossbars are across there. Here's the bat. Looks a bit like a mouse with his 2 eyes and his wings hanging down. So this tells us that Sekrety was the god of sacrifice for the Mayas who lived where this mosaic mask came from, at Monte Alban in Mexico. Okay, thanks. Right. Okay, we've only got 15 minutes left, unfortunately, and we have that much left. So there's no way, I'm afraid, we're going to get through it. But if we look at the bat on the cross there, we come out with a face here, and we come out with the face of Jesus with this white shroud over his head, the man from China that we saw earlier from the Chinese tomb, and we come out with a Mayan priest. That's when we zoom into the bat god on the cross there. You can just see the bat and its 2 eyes and its nose and its mouth. And then we'll just do one more from the mosaic mask, because these are hundreds and hundreds of pictures, not just 1 or 2. This is why they're living miracles. Here we see another arrangement, and it shows a cross here with the head of Christ on the cross, and he's cross-legged, and he's on top of a bat. There's the bat god with a V-shaped bat, the god of death, with his wings open. There's the set square of the Freemason, which Jesus is carrying, and the compasses of the Freemason are above his head. They're all contained in that picture. And this tells us that Jesus was a Freemason who died a pure person. In other words, the bat is the god of death. So he was a pure person who went to heaven. And there we can see a picture from the Bible Moralice in France from the 13th century. We see Jesus with the Freemason compasses designing the universe. But you can't see them on that picture because it's poor quality overhead projector. And there are lots of other pictures in the sunshield of Monte Alban in Mexico. And again, if we put the acetate, the transparencies at 66.6 degrees and move them together, we come out with the stag. And the stag with horns was another portrayal of Lord Pacal, the stag, because the sun goes around the earth goes around the sun every 365.25 days. And the stag sheds its antlers every 365.25 days every year. So the stag became associated with the sun. And because Jesus was the sun, he had a halo. The stag is represented as Jesus, as Lord Pacal, as Viracocha from Peru, as Qin Shi Huangdi from China. It's all the same guy who keeps coming back to earth, reincarnating over and over again. And if we go back to the 2 heads on the amazing lid of Palenque that we saw earlier, when we put the noses together, we see that one of the carvings in the tomb at Palenque had this mark on its nose, and that mark tells us how to put the transparencies together, how to break the code of the amazing lid of Palenque. That was the carving over the tomb of Lord Pacal at Palenque. And here we have it again. We have Lord Pacal facing each other, the 2 heads there. There's one head with his mouth and his eye. The mirror image, his mouth and his eye, like that. And the bat covering them, which tells us that Lord Pacal designed the sunshield of Monte Alban. And if we move the transparencies again to this position, we see a small man exposing himself here with a cloak, going like that. And we see a bat underneath him. There's the bat. I've separated the 2 there. And this tells us that those who live a bad life will go the way of the bat, and the bat lives in darkness. And here we have this arrangement here of squares, and what we see is 3 squared is 9 in the middle, 4 squared is 16, 9 times 16 is 144, and those are the ones who will go to heaven. So this tells us, in the Bible, the book of Revelation, it tells us that those with 144,000 written on their foreheads will go to heaven. So we see in all of the artifacts from the Mayas, whether it's the mosaic mask of Palenque, which showed Lord Paikal with a small bird on his head, the bird of purification, bowing as the 2 stags, which was the mural of Bonampak with 2 sticks. And the 2 sticks they used to rub together to make fire, so that's why he was the god of fire. We haven't even started. Oh yes, we did this was one of the pictures you haven't seen from the mosaic mask of a snake with wings, the feathered snake, because they believe Quetzalcoatl was the feathered snake who lived on the earth, the snake, and in the heavens. Okay. Now, this is another one which I only decoded about a year ago. And it's probably the most wonderful of all the pictures because it shows a soul actually going to heaven. Here we have an eagle, like a 747 aircraft, flying towards us. And he's got a bead in his mouth. And here we have one of the men from the tomb in Peru, a small man with a hat, I call him. And he's got a crab across his face. Remember, Viracocha was the foam of the sea. The guy who was not in the sea and he wasn't on the land, he was in the middle. He was in the foam of the sea. His name was Viracocha. Here we see Viracocha with his wings out going to heaven. And we see a man here, that's his face red, with the compasses here of the Freemason, which tells us that when these 2 transparencies are placed 99.9 degrees together, that says 99.9, that says 99.9, we come out with this composite picture here, which shows the man from Peru with the small hat that we saw earlier. And this tells us that the man in Palenque was the same man as the guy in Peru. So all of these ancient treasures, throughout history, there have been many incarnations of Jesus on earth. First of all, he started off in 2500 BC as Viracocha, foam of the sea. As Krishna, Lord Krishna, the Christos. Then he came back as Tutankhamun, the son of God. Then he came back as Lord Buddha, the perfect one. Buddha and Krishna, well, Buddha was the next incarnation of Krishna. That's what the Hindu believe. Then he came back as Qin Shi Huangdi, the first emperor, who was the feathered snake. He was the sunspot cycle. It looks like a feathered snake. Then he came back as Jesus around the year 0. Then he came back as Lord Paikal, as Viracocha around AD 300. Then he came back in Peru again as Viracocha Pachacamac in AD 500. Then he came back at Palenque in AD 750 as Lord Paikal. And throughout all of these incarnations, he encoded all of these secret pictures into his treasures to tell us how to get to heaven and how to escape going to hell when we die. And the messages of all of this stuff is that if we are pure and we can purify our spirit, we can increase the voltage of the soul inside our bodies so that when it's time for the body to die, the soul releases and escapes the earth's gravity and goes to heaven and becomes one with God. And God is electromagnetic energy. The Bible tells us that. God is light. So if we can increase the voltage of our soul by loving each other, then when the soul is released from the body, we'll go to heaven and we'll find peace again with God. If that doesn't happen, if we don't love our neighbor, then the soul will not reach the required voltage to leave the body. And when the soul leaves the body, it will attach itself to a new set of developing genes, whether it be a flower or a dog or a pig or a human being, commensurate with the voltage it generated during its lifetime on earth. So if when you're born you're a real mean person, then you'll come back with a low voltage. And when your soul leaves your body, when they put you in the coffin, you'll come back as a rat or a dog. You'll come back as a lower voltage creature. If you're a good dog, your voltage will increase. When that soul leaves the dog's body, it will come back as a chimpanzee, which is more intelligent. If you're a good chimpanzee, you'll come back as a human. If you're a good human, when your soul dies, you'll go back to God. If you're a bad human, you'll stay on the earth because you won't have enough voltage to escape, and you'll come back as a lesser creature with a lesser voltage which is coming from all of the cells in your body put together. Now, as I say, this stuff takes about 18 hours, and I've just been told I've got 8 minutes left. So, we've had terrific problems with the equipment today, and I can only apologize about that. I think, as you know, Bob Brown isn't here, and Bob understands my requirements exactly, but they're having difficulties. But it's very difficult to convey this stuff with high-tech equipment. All I want is a nice projector. That's all I need. Right? Once you start getting clever, you've got problems. Because God doesn't want us to be clever, He wants us to love each other. You see, when we love each other, the voltage of the soul gets greater and greater and greater. It's as simple as that. We're electromagnetic energy. If when we start off as 3 volts from God, the more we love, we get a halo. And it gets bigger and bigger and bigger with each incarnation, until we've got so much light coming from us that we escape the earth's gravity and we go to heaven and become one with God again. God is light. God is electromagnetic energy. But the books are available, and I don't advertise because I think this work is meant for certain people, and those people will come across this work come what may. The website's up and running. There's lots of stuff on there of a lot of interest. www.mauricecotterell.com. You can order the books from the American publishers or off the internet. They've been around now since 1995. There's 2 books here which aren't shown, The Mayan Prophecies and The Super Gods, but they're out of print and they're not available. All of the others were published by the Americans, so they're still in print. I can't show you, unfortunately, the pictures of Jesus and King Arthur and all the rest of it, because we've got no time left. If I hadn't had the problems with the equipment, I could have got up to Jesus and the Holy Grail, which is a wonderful story. The Holy Grail is alive and well in Ireland. It's there's no question about it. The same energy, the godly energy that produced everything that you've seen, produced the Holy Grail. And it's a story, it's worth reading. You can get all of the books off the internet, Amazon.com. Just look up my name and it'll come up with all of the books. And it's wonderful. One of the problems with having a short lecture is this. If I give a 16-hour lecture, there are no questions. If I give a 4-hour lecture, there are 7 days questions. If I give an 8-day lecture, there are 3.5 days questions. If I give a 12-hour lecture, there's just 2 of questions. And right now, you're going to have a lot of questions, because I'm not even halfway through the overheads. And this is a reduction of what I normally have. So it's very difficult to explain this stuff. One thing's for sure, you were meant to be here this morning and you were meant to see this. I just think it's a great shame that you can't see all of it, because it's just beautiful. And there's no question that we've all been here many, many times before. We have many incarnations. And Jesus' story was very simple. Love your neighbor and you'll go to heaven. If we love each other, the voltage inside gets bigger and bigger and bigger. We get a halo, and eventually the halo is so powerful it will escape the earth's gravity and go back to God, who is light. We'll become God again. But it's very difficult, because everything we see around us is illusion, Maya. That's what the word means. We think we see individuals when we're actually all the same person. We're here to love each other. As long as we love each other, the voltage gets greater and greater and greater. And eventually we become light beings. Now, once you start to understand all this stuff, you'll understand, because this is a UFO conference, it's very interesting, because not only are you open-minded, but you'll understand what UFOs are, why we have them. All of this information comes together, and it all starts to make sense. But the bottom line is that you are all God inside. We all have a soul. The body is the devil, 666. We're made of carbon, the carbon atom, which has 6 electrons, 6 protons, 6 neutrons. We're the body. The physical earth is made out of 666. God, the soul around us, is 144,000. And that's the speed of light. I haven't got time to tell you that, but that's the speed of light. You need to read Bruce Cathy's books. And I suppose, being a ufologist, you'll have heard Bruce Cathy, who does a lot of stuff on UFOs. But all I can say is, have a look at the books. They're all published by American publishers, Inner Traditions. They're all on the web. I've tried to make them stand alone because the Celtic Chronicles, which was the last one to come out last summer, is all about the Celtic people who had exactly the same beliefs as the Egyptians, who had exactly the same beliefs as the Incas, who had exactly the same beliefs as the ancient Chinese. And they had the same beliefs because Jesus has been back to earth many times as different leaders. It's the same guy. And we can prove this as the lecture goes on, that he must have been the same guy. But for now, I'm afraid we're out of time. So, I'm sorry.